Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Annie Cahill from Datamark, and welcome to the B2 course. This is actually just a recording with just me, not a live class. So this is not going to be an 8-hour long class. I'm just going to kind of walk through the PowerPoint, and we're going to go through the exercises, and hopefully it will give you a chance to work through the data on your own in your own office. So I'm happy to be here with you today. Again, this is the B2 course. Hopefully you all were with us for B1. But just a little bit about me. I've been with Datamark now for about 2.5 years. I provide technical oversight to all of our projects nationwide. I'm also very involved in our strategic planning and our boundary workshops. And I've been a part of this project with the state for since actually the very beginning. So I worked with Sandy and we designed the B1 course along with the state, and now we're bringing you B2. So B2 is really focused and centered on the standard applications, really the toolkit that the state is providing to you. So what this is basically going to be walking through that heavy technical side of the toolkit and how you can actually make that work for you and apply that to your own data. So just some links here for you. Again, B1, that was the class that we had a few months ago, and the recording is linked there for you on the YouTube page. Also, the actual GIS standard and toolkit download is located here at OK Maps, and then of course the state's data repository. I hope that you guys have had a chance to check that out, but those are just some links that might be really useful for you. So for the agenda today, we're going to go through kind of like a very brief recap of B1, and then we're going to dive right into the toolkit. We're going to talk about how you can use the toolkit to prepare a brand new geodatabase and create some new GIS data. We're going to talk about how to modify and standardize that GIS data using the adjustment and enhancement tools within the toolkit. And then we're also going to look at some best practices and recommendations going forward. If you've downloaded the course data, I'll show you that here in just a second. The course data is in a folder called Oklahoma Course Datasets. And actually what you'll see in there, and let me bring it up in Windows Explorer so you can see a little bit better. So I have my Windows Explorer open, and then I also have my ARC catalog. This folder is the one that we've used through all of the B2 courses, and it includes the folder for the toolkit. It includes 3 geodatabases, which you can see here in ARC catalog. It also includes a blank output folder for any outputs that are generated by the tool, and then also this field mapping document. So the way that the course was structured for efficiency is that we really tried to break it up into stages using different geodatabases so that you would kind of have that cooking show effect. That's kind of how we compared it in the very beginning, where you're kind of starting off prepping the data in one geodatabase, and then as you move through the process, each step up is going to be a little bit more prepared for you. We tried to do that again for efficiency, just so you can see how those geodatabases would look as you're going through the effort of using the toolkit to prepare that data. So that's kind of the way that it was divided up in the very beginning. You should also have available to you the B2 course prep, which is the student manual. And basically that's a walkthrough of everything that we've done in the course, starting from raw data all the way to the end to the finished data. One thing that we did not provide as material, but it's out on the state's website, is of course the addressing standard, the NG911 addressing standard. It's very important that you familiarize yourself with that, because this is really going to be the driving document behind all of the decisions that are made when you prepare your data for NG911. It's all outlined in here. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, I would highly recommend that you click that link within the PowerPoint for B1 because that's going to provide the most explanation. Okay. So if we think back to B1, we had kind of a lengthy conversation about, number one, intro to GIS for public safety professionals, intro to public safety for GIS professionals. And then we also really talked about the state standard for NG911. And part of that discussion involved understanding what our required layers are. Okay, so the required layers for NG911, meaning you have to have all of these layers in order to be compliant for NG911, are address points, road center lines, emergency service zones or ESZ boundaries, individual service boundaries for fire, law, and EMS, a PSAP boundary, and then a discrepancy agency boundary, which if you refer back to the national standard, it's actually called the provisioning boundary. So if you see provisioning boundary, that can be used interchangeably with discrepancy agency boundary. Okay, now I do have a note here that the PSAP and discrepancy agency boundaries are both ones that are maintained and provided to you by the state. So you can download those from the state's website. And there is a process that you can go through to request any changes or amendments to those boundaries. So when you download those, you'll definitely want to review them. It's going to be, the review process should consist of your GIS and your PSAP staff. You guys need to review that together, bring in any neighbors if necessary, and then decide, hey, are these boundaries answering the questions that we need them to answer? And we can talk about that in more detail a little bit later. Now, I did want to bring up the emergency service zones. Those, a lot of you already have. You may call them response zones. You may call them response areas. You may have them called ESNs or fireboxes. So you may have these under different names, but these are more of a legacy data set that directly ties back to the MSAG. Okay, the ESZ is like a geographical representation of the ESN. Okay, and there's more information about that in the standard if you need to reference that. Okay, but it is important that we level set the conversation and understand what these required layers are, because when we're going through that effort with the toolkit specifically focuses on these layers, and it has very specific tools to address things going on within the schema or the geometry within these particular layers. Okay, but these are the ones that are required. Now, in addition to the layers, there are field requirement attributes. So we did talk at length in B1 about what an actual schema is. And a schema really refers to the way that GIS data is structured within a data model. Okay, it's going to include things like the format of the data. So address points are going to be points. Road center lines are going to be lines. Your service boundaries are going to be polygon layers. It's also going to go and define what the fields are within each of those particular feature classes or layers. Okay, and those fields have priorities set to them. Okay, so there's mandatory, conditional, optional, and in the case of road center lines, you do have fields that are specifically related to transportation. Okay, and the best thing that you can do is really to pull up the addressing standard if you have any questions about the schema. This is really going to be your master guide regarding any of the layers in the model and what the schema is. Okay, so you can see here, it gives us the field name. What is that field supposed to be called? It describes the field. So if you're ever curious, like, what does that field do again? What's the purpose? You'll want to reference the field description column here. The field type, so it can either be alphanumeric, which would be like in the GIS world, we would know that as a text field, which can accommodate, you know, a number of different types of characters. Numeric or integer field, it can also have like a date time format. So that's the field type. The field width is how many characters can be accommodated within that field. And then like we just talked about, the priority, which would be mandatory, conditional, or optional, or like I said, in the case of road center lines, it can also be transportation related. And so you'll definitely want to reference these, because a lot of you are maintaining your data for certain business needs, and you might be missing some of these fields. You might have some of them, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. And then finally, within the standard, there's a column called domain table. And if you remember from B1, the domains really provide a good pick list within the attribute table as you're editing your GIS data. So you won't have to type United States over and over again. You won't have to type Oklahoma over and over again. You won't have to type your agency ID over and over again. And really what this does is it helps to standardize the data and minimize error. Really, really important. So let's talk about doing a current state assessment of your data and what that really means. So as someone who goes into different localities, and I work with people and do strategic planning, we talk about all of these different things, right? And there's also a big workflow component as well. But for now, when we are talking about just the data, we're going to talk about these things, okay? So you want to look at the accuracy. Is your data reflecting what's in the real world? Do you have all of your address points on top of the building footprints or on top of the structures? Or are you maintaining address points just at the parcel centrally? What are the risks involved there with that? Maybe you have a large property that's 10 acres and you've got 16 buildings, and you've only got one structure point in the middle of the parcel. These are all things that we need to think about. In your road center lines, are you maintaining all of your road center lines? Or do you have that data broken up across different feature classes? Okay, so accuracy, how accurate is the information that you're showing? And it's not just in the geometry, right? So we have to understand that GIS, again, is that marriage of the geography and the information. So we have to make sure that both things are accurate. You don't want to have address points with incorrect attribution, okay? You can have the address point in the correct location, but if the attributes are wrong, then it's still incorrect, okay? Currency. How current is the data that you're showing? You want to make sure that as your community is going through construction projects or different road projects, that you're getting that information into GIS as quickly as possible. And within the data model, you can even set expiration dates on certain features so that you have kind of like a time set there. If something is only temporary, if you have a temporary entrance into a property, it's only valid until this date. And that way you can go in and adjust that as necessary. But you want to make sure that what you're showing is current. You don't want to use data that's super out of date, because ultimately this data is going to be feeding not only your CAD system, but also being provisioned into the EZNet, which is really where a lot of that magic happens, okay? Consistency. You want to make sure that your data is consistent across all data sets. We can have a perfect address point data set or a perfect road center line data set or perfect boundary data sets, but we need to make sure that they're all reflecting the same appropriate information, okay? And then where it concerns completeness, there's a few facets there. So number one, you want to make sure that all of the layers are present, okay? So that you have all of these layers. Individual service boundaries for fire, law, and EMS. You got to have address points. You got to have road center lines. You got to have these state layers. You got to have your ESCs. All of these should be present and maintained, okay? You also want to make sure that all of those attributes are filled in appropriately, okay? Get to know the data model. Get to know the schema. Make sure that you're not missing any of these mandatory attributes, okay? Because those are going to cause issues if you're missing them. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're representing all of the features within your layer. So that's kind of where we get back into that addressing discussion. How many of you are missing chunks of addresses? How many of you, and this is something that we work with all the time with localities, they have, they might be a larger county who has, 3 or 4 smaller municipalities, and those municipalities might be their own addressing authority, and there might be very poor communication from the munis back to the county. So effectively, the county might be missing chunks of addressing data. Okay. Alternatively, you may not have very good sub-addressing. Okay, sub-addressing is not required, but it is certainly useful for our first responders to know that when they're going onto a property that has 6 buildings, they know what apartments are within each building. Each building has its own number. Each building number has its own, sub-addressing within it. So it's really, really important to have all of the features represented within the layer and all of those attributes filled out. Okay, you don't want to put 8 points on top of an apartment building with the same address. Each one has to be unique. All right, so these are all things that we want you to think about in terms of completeness. So the pre-toolkit data assessment is something that I highly, highly recommend. And what this means is that you're essentially, for the GIS folks, this is essentially field mapping on paper. This is getting to know your data. This is understanding the obvious gaps in your data that you can identify just by looking at it. Okay, so when you look at your geodatabase and you see, okay, well, I have 2 of the X number of layers, then that right there is the first thing that you need to address, right? You know that, okay, well, I can download these 2 boundaries from the state, but I'm missing address points. So I have to address that. That's a big deal. You also need to look at your schema within your own data. Okay, and part of that involves a deeper look at how you're using the data within your organization today. A lot of people are kind of at an enterprise level with their GIS data, and their GIS data consequently is supporting a number of enterprise level applications like asset management, or perhaps you're using it in your permitting system for your planning and zoning. I mean, we have clients who the sun rises and sets on their permitting system, which ties back to the addressing. So when you start talking to them about changing the schema, they get really squirrely, and it makes them really nervous because they think if you change one thing in the schema, you're going to break the whole system. So this is all stuff that you'll want to understand, because we don't operate in a bubble, right? There's a number of different things here. So we have to make sure that as we're preparing our data for NG911, number one, that we're still able to meet our existing business needs. So whatever your GIS data is supporting, you're going to want to make sure that your GIS data can continue supporting that. And sometimes that opens up a much bigger conversation. Okay. Sometimes that leads to, well, do we need to maintain 2 different data sets? Do we need 2 different road centerline data sets? Because one is being used for this application, but then our NG911 needs are totally different. So we're going to have to maintain 2 different ones. Maybe it's going to lead to an ETL process where you're just going to extract what you need and put that into a new schema. Maybe that involves what I crudely call Frankensteining your schemas together, which means that you are basically just going to take what's missing from your schema, from the NG911 schema, and you're going to add that into your own. So you're kind of like combining schemas together. That way you only have to maintain 1 data set. Okay. These are all things that before you go through this effort, I want you to think about. I want you to think about this, because this is where people kind of get into trouble, especially if they are in more of a silo environment where they're not communicating well with, or there's, minimal communication at all between, the GIS or the data authority and then everyone else. That's why I kind of get a little nervous when I talk to people and they say, yeah, our road center lines, those are maintained by a guy in the transportation department. And we just pull it from their geodatabase. Well, this is where you're going to have to kind of assess and have that conversation, because their business needs are going to be very different than NG911. All right. So just understanding that. So what we've done, and I'll go back to this window here. We did provide in the course data sets folder that we used in the live class, a field mapping document. So this field mapping was actually pulled from the state's website. And it was a much larger Excel document, but really we retained the road center lines, and we added a column here for source data field mapping. All right, this schema that you see here, this is the standard. So if I come down here to the road center lines, this is the Excel version of the schema that's here within the standard. Okay. And really what we've done is highlighted the fields that are mandatory. So you can see right off the bat, well, you know what, I have a field called street name, and that's actually going to fit here because here it's telling me what's the primary street name. Well, if my field is called street name, I can just come in here and type in street name into this field, and that's my field mapping on paper. Okay, this can be however you want it to look. This was just the easiest because, like I said, this was already made available on the state's website in an Excel format. So I think that it would be easy, really easy to pull it down from there. And you can add as many columns as you want. You know, if there's fields within your data that you know you have to have, then maybe you make those a different color and you tack them down here at the bottom. This way it's going to give you a clear layout, and there's not going to be any questions about, you know, how you're using existing fields, what fields you're going to need, etc. So what you would do is come in here and just mark the name of your field wherever you see something that applies. And this is going to be the biggest effort, I think, for you, is just really assessing. I mean, you know, when I was in local government, I can't remember the last time I really did an in-depth assessment of my schema. It is going to take a long time, but it's definitely worth it because this can be a record for you going forward for any of your business needs. So anytime your county or your municipality wants to adopt another or implement another type of system, you know, you can already have that mapped out and you can understand what the field type is and if you have any fields that would meet that business need for that particular application implementation. So this is just one way of doing this. I know some people actually write it down on paper. They have a notebook and they write it on paper, and that's the best way of making it work for them. However you do it, I would just highly recommend that you do it in whatever way is the easiest for you, because this is only going to help going forward, because you are going to have to go through the field mapping to get your data prepped for NG911. Okay. Understanding the standard is really important. Just really going in here and becoming familiar with these fields, asking questions if you don't understand, if you're not getting what you need from the field description, you know, reach out to Charles or Shelley to get a little bit more information about that, just so that you can have a better understanding of how this information is being used and what the best value is going to be for that field. So definitely get to know the standard. And also there's a lot of really good information there about addressing and, you know, just some tips if you're looking at ways to improve your addressing system within your county. There's also some good info in there as well. So the good thing about the toolkit is that it can help you create new GIS data. I will go ahead and drop this link here again, that these are some, this link has some publicly available data sources that you can download. But hopefully most of you won't have to start from scratch with your address points or road center lines. But if you do, here are some different ways that you could accomplish that. For address points, you can definitely generate those from the centroid of either a parcel or building footprint. You can also go out and collect those manually. If you have a GPS unit, you can also georeference and digitize that way. The same with your road center lines. You could use field collection, or you could do some planimetric collection if you have any recent ortho images. So those are just some different ways, but these are pretty big data sets for a lot of people. And I would strongly recommend that you maybe look into using a vendor if you're missing any of these. I know that there is some funding left from the state. So if you're watching this and you know you're feeling really unsure about your data preparation and collection in general, this might be something that you want to pursue as far as the funding. So reach out to Charles and Shelley about that. Now, as far as our boundary data, When we create those from scratch, as GIS people, we have to be very careful, okay? And the reason is because we are people who do the work, we draw the lines, but we are not public safety people. Most of us are not, okay? And it's really important, and this is kind of the little thing that I drop in here for each of these classes, but your roles as GIS professionals are changing. NG911 is really changing your role. And what does that mean? Well, what that means is that you are a geospatial first responder. Let that sink in for a second. Before a call ever comes into a PSAP, before an emergency responder arrives on scene, your data is being used. You are, in a way, the first one on the scene without even realizing it, okay? And you would have to go back to B1 to understand that part of the conversation, but your GIS data is being used to determine who gets the call first, which is incredibly important because we know that in public safety, seconds matter. Seconds are a matter of life and death in a lot of cases, okay? So your data is being used to determine who gets the call. All right. So with that being said, you really don't want to make any decisions about your boundaries in a vacuum. These are not legislative boundaries. These are call routing boundaries. So try to do the mental gymnastics to detach the legislative boundary mindset from the call routing boundary one, because call routing boundaries can be modified and adjusted. Legislative cannot without obviously some type of legal action, right? But you really want to adjust or build these with your PSAP. There are very specific questions that you should be asking of your data. The very first one is who gets the call first? Who should be receiving this call? Does the boundary accurately reflect the area of the PSAP that should be getting the call? Okay, so ESZs, those are not call routing boundaries, okay, but those tie back to the MSAG, and that's going to require you to ask the question: is our MSAG doing its job? Can I trust my MSAG? Okay, do I need to make any adjustments to my boundaries or my MSAG based on what we know? And that is absolutely something that you're going to have to work with your public safety staff on, okay? So although ESZs are not used for call routing because they're more of a legacy data set, because again, they are tied back to the MSAG, you still want to make sure that they're accurate, because you're not just going to create these boundaries and then turn off using the MSAG. Your MSAG is going to be in use for a really long time, okay, until that final switchover occurs. So you want to make sure that your MSAG and your GIS data are answering the same questions. Okay. The PSAP boundary and the discrepancy agency boundary are, like I said, maintained at the state level. However, you do need to download those, look and see if they're accurate. The discrepancy agency boundary is really like a geofence around the data for which you are responsible. Okay, so you'll need to look at that and say, well, you know what, I really actually maintain all of this stuff that's outside of this boundary. Okay, so go through that process then to adjust that boundary as necessary. Okay, ESBs, you can build ESBs from your ESZs. You can definitely do that, and you can use the toolkit to help you do that. But again, all of these boundaries, you should be engaging your PSAP staff. So if you've never had conversation with your PSAP before, I definitely recommend that you do that, because you don't want the burden of responsibility to be on you as a GIS person for why a call routing boundary was not drawn correctly. Okay, we draw the line, you let the PSAP staff tell you where to draw it. All right, and then if you have any questions, you can engage the state folks and they would be happy to talk through some scenarios with you. All right, So now let's talk about the NG911 GIS Toolkit and what that actually is. So what the toolkit is it's a state provided tool to help you prepare your GIS data for NG911. All right. It's going to take those, and I mentioned this earlier, it's going to adjust and modify and help build data based on those mandatory fields and mandatory layers. All right. They're all going to be standards compliant. All right. So it's going to transform your data to meet the Oklahoma standards. And there's a lot of different tools. So I want to level set the conversation before we actually go into this to help you to understand that this is not a wizard. It's not a wizard. It's not going to say, okay, you've completed step 1, go to step 2, now go to step 3. It's a toolkit. Just like you have a box of tools at home and you're going to choose the appropriate tool for the job that you need to do around your home, that's exactly how you need to approach this toolkit. Okay, there are some tools in the toolkit that you may never touch. There are some that you may use on a regular basis. Okay, so that's how we have to approach this. But let me talk about some of the functionality. So first and foremost, it helps you create a standards compliant geodatabase. Okay, it also can create new data layers for you if you're missing any in a standards compliant schema, most importantly. There are field mapping tools that help you take what you're going to do here and actually field map into the Oklahoma standard. Okay, do that for your GIS data. And then there are going to be some tools that help you populate those required fields. And then finally, there are topology and validation tools to help you QA and QC your data. Those are the main things that we're going to be going over today. In the B3 course, which is scheduled for August, we are going to review the MSAG tools, and then there are submission tools. So there's other elements of that toolkit that we're not going to review specifically today, but just be advised that they exist. Okay. So when you go to download this, you're going to go here to this link, and there may be a newer version out there right now, but the version that we've tested and built this course around is actually going to be version 3.2. Okay, that's the version that we're on. So when you download this, you're going to see that it comes in this kind of nested folder structure. You want to leave it in this folder structure. Okay, you don't want to move folders around. You don't want to do any of that because you could get some unexpected results or something may not work correctly. Okay. You're going to see there are 4 folders here within the toolkit download. The first is the docs folder. Those are just individual help documents for every subtool. Okay. So each one of those is going to have an individual help document associated with it. There's also going to be a folder for the domains, which tie directly back to these domains here. Okay, you don't want to go in and mess with any of the domains. You don't want to go in there and try to modify that. Okay. Fields. It's gonna have the fields that are required here. So it's gonna link back to these fields, right? And the type. And then of course, any scripts that are associated with the tool. So there are these folders here. You really don't need to worry about, like I said, the domains, fields, or scripts folders. You may go into the docs folder to pull up an individual README for one of those tools, whatever you need. You're also going to see a flow chart here, and I'll get back to that in just a second. The actual toolkit itself, which only opens, you need to open that either within ArcMap or ArcCatalog. And then of course, the overall README for the toolkit. So if I open the README, what this is going to do is pull up a separate browser window, and then this actually has all of the README in it for all of the tools. okay? So it's going to have the adjustment tools, comparison, all of these, and you can just kind of jump around within the document, okay? I don't usually go into the docs folder here for help. I usually just open the general README and access what I need that way, but you can do it either way. All right. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to this flow chart here. This flow chart is something that the developers added in kind of at our request, because we do understand that there are some novice GIS users who may be looking at this kind of like a wizard. And again, this is not a wizard. This is a toolkit, okay? So you're going to have to kind of assess your data, think critically about what it is you need to use, and then proceed from there. But this flow chart was included to kind of help you make those decisions. All right, so if you're ever stuck or you're unsure about where you're at in a particular stage, then you can always reference this flow chart to help you make a better decision. Okay, so I do recommend that you leverage this, especially if you're new to this. And also within that folder, there is a separate document just for that flow chart. Okay, so it's included within the README, and then it's included as a separate document within the folder. That's the toolkit download. Okay. So in addition to the flow chart, down here where it says OK Prep Tools, there is a link to the examples document. It says for more information on where to start as a user, see the examples. So if I click examples, I can go through here and look at these different examples that are provided that could potentially meet where I am in stage of readiness. Okay, so the first one here tells me, okay, if the data set is already standards compliant, then what's my next step? If it's partially standards compliant, what do I need to do? Okay, if it's not standards compliant, or if I don't have existing data, here are some pointers. All right, so that's another place where you could go. So there are two really good options for understanding where to start, or just kind of getting you started. The one thing that I will say is that when I say we, I mean DataMark, we really within this this B2 course prep tried to pick a scenario for this course and this exercise that really reflected the larger situation nationwide. Okay, and what I mean by that is most of us are going to be starting with road center lines, address points, and at least ESEs. Maybe you don't have ESEs, that's fine. But a lot of you will be in this building phase or this assessment phase, and you'll say, okay, as I'm going down the list, I'm checking off the different data layers that I have, I'm missing a few. Well, already off the bat, you don't have to worry about your discrepancy agency or your PSAP, because those are coming from the state. But the other layers, you know, you will want to understand where you're at. So that's why you need to start with that pre-assessment. Okay, but we built this exercise around people who have some and not others, because that is very accurate for the clients with whom we work nationwide. They have a couple, but they don't have the rest. Most people don't have the call routing boundaries. If anything, they'll have ESCs, but they may not have ESBs. Okay, or their address points might be just a simple address with no other attribute information tied to it. Okay, so there's quite a bit there, but we did try to build this. So you do have really 3 good resources that you can reference as you're going through this effort. So you have that flow chart, you have the examples within the document, the README, and then you also have this exercise. So I'm hoping that between those 3, you can find the best path forward that meets your organization's needs. Okay, and if not, then you can always reach out to Charles or Shelley and see if they have any pointers or any tips. Okay. So we've covered the downloading of the toolkit. Let's talk about the technical requirements and then the soft skills as well. So first and foremost, this toolkit was built using version 10.7. So that's the version that you'll want to go with for this. If you're a pro user, you cannot use this for pro. This is not going to work for you, okay? A few weeks ago, we did talk to the developers and they said that there are plans to develop a version for pro, but since they are rigorously building this out, I feel like they're focusing a lot of their attention on the desktop version. I think that's where their focus is for right now. So if you are a pro user and you're holding out for that, it might be a while. So you definitely want to make sure that you're using 10.7. And like I said, if you have any questions about, a version for pro, you can reach out to Charles and Shelley to kind of get the status on that. Now, as far as the soft skills are concerned, you really do want to have a GIS background for this tool. You don't have to be an expert user, okay, but you should have experience that includes being able to navigate through ArcMap and ArcCatalog, understanding how to manipulate an attribute or manipulate and edit attributes within an attribute table, as well as also editing geometry of these different features, like splitting road center lines and merging them and so forth. Working through the toolkit, being comfortable with that, okay, which comes with time. You also need to understand how to critically think in a GIS public safety environment, which is going to be new to a lot of us. But the thing is that when you make one decision in the data, that can affect something else that you might not be thinking about. For example, when you go to split a road center line, you need to be aware that your NGUID, which is a required field within every layer, your NGUID is going to duplicate across those two because you've done the split. Okay, so you need to think about things like that and how that's going to affect the data down the road. Okay, so you definitely do need to have some GIS skills here. If you don't, or if this is kind of the first time that you're seeing GIS, I would definitely talk to the people within your locality and see if this is something that you're going to be able to do, because this is a heavy lift. It really is. And I will tell you that the heaviest lift of any NG9-1 deployment is not in the hardware software call taking equipment. It's always in the GIS data, always. And the reason is because our GIS emerged out of different business needs. GIS really started as a planning and development tool. Okay, so a lot of our data sets came from planning or came from, land use type data sets. Okay, so there is going to be a greater effort in prepping these to be used for public safety. And we have to take a really critical look. And often that means that these data sets have been maintained by other people and the data authority still remains those people. So if those people are not really GIS folks and they don't really have a public safety background, then you can see where this might be a little bit difficult. Okay, but this is the heaviest lift. So I do recommend that you have some experience here. And if you are not comfortable, then maybe you need to have that conversation and like we mentioned earlier, look into some of that funding to go with someone who can help clean up your data. Okay, we can do that. There are other vendors out there who can do it. We definitely know the toolkit, that's for sure. So any questions related to the toolkit or its technical support are going to be directed to Mrs. Shelley Willoughby, and this is her contact information. I'm sure that many of you have already spoken with her at some point. She's a wonderful lady, very talented GIS professional, and she can help you with all of that stuff. All right. So now we're actually going to get into the toolkit. So this would be a really good time. Number one, you can go ahead and follow along with me, or at the conclusion of the exercise, what you may want to watch me do is just watch me go through what we're going to be doing, and then I can tell you, okay, pause, and then you can work through it on your own. But we are going to work through this, and I will let you know exactly what we're going to be doing. So let's talk about our scenario. Our scenario here is that we are a GIS analyst who manages our county's GIS data in one geodatabase. Now, you guys might have multiple geodatabases. That's good. That's super common. But a lot of times when we get geodatabases as a vendor, it's usually one. It's just one geodatabase with a bunch of different data. Some of it may not even be public safety related. Okay. If you're a smaller locality, you might only have the one geodatabase, and that's okay. It's like I said, there's no right or wrong way. It's whatever works the best for your business needs. Okay. But this is where we're going to take a look at that source geodatabase. So I mentioned to you earlier that we are working within 3 different geodatabases for this course. So the first geodatabase, and again, this is an ARC catalog. Okay, you can see the folders here for the geodatabases, but if you try to go into a folder here, you're not going to be able to get anything because you can't open this through Windows Explorer. You have to go through a GIS application like ARC catalog to get to this geodatabase, okay, or ArcMap. But the OK_source data_initial, that's our starting data. This is the data that you maintain in your office today, okay, for your different business needs. So I have road center lines, I have ESDs, and I have my address points, which are called SSAP, site structure address points, okay? I also have the discrepancy agency boundary and the PSAP boundary. Now, this is where I would ask the class, where do those data sets come from? And we already talked about this earlier, that both the discrepancy agency and the PSAP are maintained at the state level. So as a smart and proactive GIS person, I went ahead and downloaded those 2 boundaries from the state because I know that I'm going to be building this geodatabase for NG911, and I want to go ahead and get all of my layers. And let's face it, these are pretty much 2 freebies that you can download. Now, we've already had the discussion about how y'all need to download these, review them, and make any changes if necessary using that process that we talked about in B1. But for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to pretend like we've gone through that effort, and these are our 2 data sets that we've downloaded, okay? But I just want to point out my center lines here. So I can preview this in ARC Catalog. And I can go ahead and view the attribute table right here in ARC Catalog. And I can see, now remember, we're also, at this point, we would go through this field mapping effort, right? So this would be the document that we would reference because this has the standard compliant fields, and it tells us the field width and the priority and all of those things. And at this point, this is where I would go through and I would look at what I have versus what the state is requiring. Okay. So I would go through here and see, okay, well, I've got some range fields here. I've got a from left, to left, from right, to right. I can map those here, and I would just write those field names in here. So I would have that understanding, right? And I would already have those documented. But I can see here by doing this assessment that my fields are not compliant. Okay, there is no field called street all, so that's why I would go through and do that field mapping. Does this fit anywhere? I already explained that these could meet the requirements for the road ranges that are required within the schema. I have abbreviated values here. Those are not going to work because going forward in NG911, they all have to be spelled out, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Okay. But this is part of that pre-assessment that I would need to do. I would need to go through and determine, what do I have? What does the state require? What holes can I fill in here using the data that I already have? Okay, so the source data is largely non-compliant with the exception of these 2 layers because these came from the state. Okay, and when I say non-compliant, what I mean is they don't have the appropriate schema, and they're consequently probably missing some fields, some data. And also the naming conventions are not appropriate either. Okay, and largely, most of you will find that your actual geodatabase is not compliant because it does not have the appropriate coordinate system or feature data sets that are required for it to be compliant. So that's the biggest part of this, is that our source data is our non-compliant data that we're starting off with, okay, save for these two boundaries in here that are compliant. All right. And I almost said any questions, but I'm by myself and my dog would stare at me like I'm a weirdo. Well, he already does that anyway. You guys know about my dog. I've talked to you about him before. Anyway, so this is the data that we are starting with, okay? So again, we have our road center lines, we have address points, and we already have ESZs. And then we do have these two boundaries that were downloaded from the state that we can start using. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the toolkit, because I just want to show you briefly what it looks like. So here's those folders that we discussed, okay? And then of course the flow chart document, which you can open in Windows Explorer. But within the toolkit, you have these different, I don't know what you'd call them, toolboxes or subtools or whatever. The OK Prep tools is where you're going to be spending a lot of your time, because those tools are really the foundation for everything else. There's a tool to create a brand new geodatabase, and then all of your field mapping tools. Okay. And you know from going through this effort that your field mapping is going to take the longest. And once you see us go through that field mapping, you're going to understand why this is almost a necessity, because it's going to be really annoying for you to sit there with the tool open and try to do that field mapping, on the fly without giving it any thought. I mean, for practice, it's one thing, but when you're going, you're doing the real deal, you really should have something like this to work from. So this is the prep tools. Then we have adjustment tools, which largely contain tools to help you standardize your data, and those are just very quick tools that that can help you in your QC and will help you standardize a lot of those fields. Comparison tools compare an old NG9-1 geodatabase with a new one. We won't go through those today. The enhancement tools have a lot more of the geoprocessing functionality. There is the Checkroad ESN, which at this version was not working appropriately, but I think in the subsequent version it is working. So we're not going to go through that one today, but we may save that for B3. But the rest of these do have some things to calculate labels and parity and so forth. So more of that field calculation. But then, like I said, it also does contain more of that geoprocessing functionality. The MSAG tools were another tool set that were not ready for this release. So those would be in B3. Submission tools are B3, and then the validation tools are what you're going to use to do that final validation of your data before you submit it to the repository. Okay, and we'll go through that later on. So I just wanted to show you kind of the overview of the toolkit. Now, where we're going to be starting is in our exercise, and we've kind of given you an overview here. And I do have that note that the layers are managed by the state and downloaded from the link posted above in helpful links. We do talk about that pre-assessment there. And where we're actually starting is going to be with the Create Geodatabase. Now, let me talk about that for just a second. Most of us are maintaining our GIS data in a geodatabase that may have multiple feature data sets because of topologies. It may be in our local coordinate system, which at the local level, you're probably using NAD83 state plane coordinate system. So when I was in local government, it was NAD83 state plane Virginia North, or UTM or something along those lines. The National Standard Coordinate System is WGS84, okay? So that's going forward what has to be the coordinate system for all of your NG911 data. Now you can still continue maintaining in your local, which you'll need for your existing business needs. But as far as the submission aspect and building, it does need to be in WGS84, okay? So one of the cool things about the prep tools is that it does create a geodatabase with that coordinate system. So let's take a look at the README real fast. And I'm going to go through this back and forth throughout this entire class, because this really should be second nature to you to have this open as you are working through this toolkit, especially the first couple of times. Okay. So if I look at the OK prep, it says the prep tools will map the feature class fields to a new feature class with the correct field names, types, lengths, and domains. It also creates a new user-named geodatabase in the folder location defined with a selected coordinate reference system and the correct domains from the domain files. Okay, so you don't have to worry about how you're currently maintaining your existing geodatabase if you're using NAT83, State Plane, or UTM, however you're maintaining. If you go through this create geodatabase, it's going to go ahead and create a geodatabase with the appropriate coordinate system, and it's also going to set those domains. Okay, so it's going to go through and say, okay, well, on this field you have this domain, on this field you have this domain, etc. So running through that one tool is actually going to accomplish a lot. All right, so let's take a look at that. So the Create Geodatabase can be found in the prep tools. So if you expand next to where it says one OK prep, it's this very first one here called Create GDB. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to tell it where I want to put that new geodatabase. Okay, I'm going to choose my tool outputs folder, and I'm going to click add, and that's just a single click, guys, and then you click add. And again, you may want to work along with me, or you may just want me to finish this and pause and then tell you guys to work through it. For the output geodatabase, I'm going to call this test, and this is all in your student manual. Let me hop back over here real quick so you can see. So this is what we're working through right now. Okay, you can see here where it says spatial reference. This is already chosen for us. Okay, it's in the appropriate coordinate system. It's there. Okay, now these parameter boxes, which are these white boxes here, are areas where you can point that tool to already compliant data sets. What does that mean? It means that the data set has the appropriate name and it has the appropriate fields, and basically the data set is standards compliant. Okay, the layer. So I know that I already have address points. Okay, and I know that by doing that pre-assessment that they're not standards compliant. We also took a look at the road center lines. We know that those are not standards compliant. Now, the discrepancy agency, because that's one that I downloaded from the state, I know that that's going to be standards compliant. Okay, so I'm going to open and go into my source data, and I'm going to choose my discrepancy agency boundary to populate that parameter box, because I know that since I downloaded that from the state, it is standards compliant. The state's not going to put non-standards compliant data on the site. Okay, I'm also going to do the same down here for the PSAP and click add. Now, you might remember from looking at our geodatabase that, let's see, so we have center lines, and we know that those are not standards compliant, so that would not be appropriate for this parameter box. The discrepancy agency boundary is fine. The PSAP boundary is fine. Those are both standards compliant. Address points we know are not standards compliant. And again, we are assuming this because we are pretending like we already went through that pre-assessment effort, right? We know that our ESZs are also not standards compliant, so those would not be appropriate here. Now, one thing you'll notice is that we are missing ESBs. We are missing ESBs for fire law and EMS. I do want to point out that the prep tools have a tool called Dissolve ESZ. And I am going to show you how to use this here in just a minute. But I'm not going to create brand new ESBs because this tool exists. Now, you'll have to understand your data to know if you can use this tool for your data. That's why I'm telling you that, you need to think about this toolkit as like a toolkit and not a wizard, because if your data is not formatted correctly, you may not be able to use Dissolve ESZ. Okay, and I'll explain that to you here in a few minutes. But I will say that if you're missing any of those, you can go ahead and create them using these boxes here, these check boxes. So if you were missing address points, you could click the box to create a blank address point feature class, okay? And basically what that would do is create the blank feature class with the standards compliant schema. Now there's not going to be any data in there. It's just going to be blank, but that schema is going to be set for you. And all you need to do is just start digitizing and populating. Okay, so this is really nice because you don't have to worry about getting, going through that effort of creating that brand new blank feature class and setting domains. That's already done for you using this tool. Okay, but for right now, I'm just going to populate the discrepancy agency, the PSAP boundary, because I know that those are both standards compliant because I downloaded them from the state. And then later on, I'm going to use the Dissolve ESZ because I can use that to create my ESBs. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And you can see that the tool is running through this process. And this does take a moment. Okay. Now, at this point, if you would like to go ahead and pause the recording so that you can work through this and then return to the recording, that would probably be a good idea. Okay, so after you get that to run, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into my tool outputs, and I can see here that test.gdb has been created. The other important thing, besides having the standards compliant geodatabase, which includes the appropriate coordinate system and the domain set, are these feature data sets. These are super important. Well, really, it's this one here. We're not really going to focus on optional layers for this course because they're optional, they're not required. We are focusing on the core required layers that we discussed a little while ago. So if I expand this NG911 feature data set, I can see here that the toolkit automatically brought in my discrepancy agency boundary and my PSAP boundary through that process because I selected those and populated those parameter boxes with those two data layers. Okay, so this is also really important to have this feature data set. And if we go back to the README, what it's going to do is it says if you don't provide any feature classes, the geodatabase and its feature data sets will not contain any feature classes, but the domains and feature dataset coordinate systems will still be set. Well, we know that we did get 2 of those feature classes to come through because we populated those. Okay, but I did want to point out to you here that it is really important to have the feature data set. That's why you don't want to go through and just say, well, I can just go ahead and create a file geodatabase myself and dump my 911 layers in there. No, that won't do. You definitely don't want to do that because it's not going to be standards compliant. And the toolkit makes it so easy to get all of that set for you right from the very start. Okay, so if I go in here and I look at the properties of that geodatabase, I can verify that all the domains have been set, right? With the coded values. So why make it harder than it has to be? Just go through this effort, okay? So we've created a brand new geodatabase. The new geodatabase has the correct coordinate system. It has the domain set. It also created this featured data set called NG911, which is really important. And we've already chosen for 2 of those layers to automatically be brought over through that process, okay? So our next step is to go ahead and do a little bit of field mapping. And when I say a little bit, that's because we only do it a little bit. I'm not going to have you guys field map every single thing, okay? At the bottom of page 3, we can see only the center lines feature class is going to be mapped. But you will want to field map all of the ones that apply. And in this case, it would be all of the layers that you have, okay, for NG911. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my road field map tool. Now, what it's asking me to do here is to choose my layer, okay? Because what I need to do is find out, it's basically doing this again, but this is going to make it easy because if you've already done this, you've already done your pre-assessment and you've already done your field mapping in advance, then this is just a matter of referencing back and forth between the toolkit and the document, okay? That's why I don't recommend doing this for the first time through this tool because things can get missed, right? Like country and county look a lot alike. You know, you want to make sure that you're going through and being really thorough, okay? But I have to provide my source layer here for the top box. So I'm going to go into my source data and choose center lines and click add. And I want you to see what happened here. Because I have field names that are already standards compliant, it automatically pulled through most of those field names, okay? If your field names are not standards compliant, which most of us, you know, like I said, are using field names and values that are not standards compliant, you're going to have to go through and populate each one of these manually, okay? So you're going to go through that effort through all of these. Now, if you don't populate these, see where it says optional here? It doesn't mean that the field itself is optional. It means that providing it with your field is optional. If you leave this whole thing blank, what this is going to do is it's going to create a blank schema for you. Well, it's going to be populated with null values. But anything where you did not provide a value is going to be populated with null values. I don't want you to get confused. Just because it says optional next to it, you know that by going through this, that only certain fields within here are optional, right? This is really referring to building that attribute table itself. But because I already had some field names that were standards compliant, this is again back to the cooking show thing. Because we already have a lot of standards compliant fields in here, it's going to go ahead and pull those through automatically. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to populate the range fields. And before I do that, I just want to show you real quick, because I showed you a second ago. So I have range fields in here, okay? And what I'm going to do is create a standards compliant version of my source, and I'm going to field map these values into that, okay? Just wanted to kind of explain what we're doing here. So I'm going to choose my center lines from my source. And for my output geodatabase, I'm going to provide the test geodatabase because that's where I want it to put my new feature class. Again, it pulls through my names. Now, for the range information, those are going to be on page 4 of your guide for how to field calculate those, or populate those, excuse me. So the left from, I'm going to choose from left. And this does take a second. So if this happens, just know that that's expected behavior. The left to, it's going to be to left. And this is another good reason why it's a good idea to do this on paper first. The right from is going to be from right. And the right to is going to be to right. Okay, so those are the only 4 that we're going to field map. But you would do this for every field. And like I said, if you leave them blank, it's just going to put null values in that field for you, okay? That you'll have to go back and populate later, especially if it's a mandatory field. So I've only field mapped these 4 fields. I'm going to click OK. And I will tell you that, you know, besides whatever cleanup you may have to do, the field mapping does take quite a while, not only in that pre-assessment effort, but then also going through this process. So you can see here that when the field mapping is complete, it does provide a new road centerline feature class here within our geodatabase. So let's take a look at that. If I preview that through Art Catalog, I can see here that I now have a standards compliant schema. And I know that because if I go back to the standard, I can actually see that I have a discrepancy agency ID field. I have a lot of these. Now they're not in order, okay, but you can be confident going through this field mapping that this is standards compliant. Okay, so like the revision date and so forth, that's further down here within the standard. But you know that going through the field mapping, it's all standards compliant. But where I didn't provide a value from my own data, because I don't currently maintain in my source data, I don't currently maintain a discrepancy agency ID, it went ahead and populated those with null values. Okay. So yeah, anywhere I did not provide a value, it was populated with null. Now let's scroll over to my ranges, and you can see here that the values that I provided through that field mapping were populated here going through that effort. Basically anything where a value was provided, whether or not it was manual or whether it was done automatically, those were all populated through. Okay. If you want to work through that, that is going to be on pages 3 and 4 of your student guide. And this would be a good opportunity to pause and work through that on your own. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create brand new ESBs using the Dissolve ESZ tool. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this real quick. I'm going to go to my source data, and I'm going to show you first the geography. So this is my ESZ. And then I'm going to show you the attributes. Okay. So a lot of you have really extensive ESZs because, like I said earlier, ESZs are more of a legacy data set because we've had them for a long time and they are directly associated back to your MSAG often because of the ESN. But I want you to notice here that my service types are defined in 3 separate fields, one for fire, one for law, and one for EMS. Okay, so I have my police field, my fire field, and my medical field. Within the OK Prep tools, there is a tool called Dissolve ESZ. And what this does is it looks at individual fields to build brand new emergency service boundaries from data that you already have. Okay. Now, it's like I mentioned earlier about the whole choosing the best tool. This will only work for you if this is true. Okay. This will only, Dissolve ESZ is only going to work for you if this is true, that you have each of your service types defined in individual fields. Okay, and I'll show you that. So I have in my source data, I have my ESZs. I'm going to open the tool for Dissolve ESZ. For combined input, that's really just going to be the source data. So that's going to be my ESZs from my source data initial. My output geodatabase, I'm going to choose my test and my tool outputs folder. For EMS, I'm going to choose fire. For fire, whoops, that didn't make sense. For EMS, I'm going to choose medical. For fire, I'm going to choose fire. And for law, I'm going to choose police. Okay. So you see what this is doing. It's saying, okay, from the larger data set, I'm going to break apart that data based on these individual fields. Okay, so when I run this, I'll show you the results. And watch what happens to our test geodatabase. And it just takes a couple minutes, maybe not that long, but a few moments, I should say. Okay, so if you look here in our test geodatabase, which is where we've really been, building up our data, we can see now that in addition to the two boundaries that we brought over through creating the geodatabase and then the field mapping that we did with the road center lines, that now we have individual ESBs for fire law and EMS. Okay, so if I look at the EMS boundary, then the fire boundary, and the law boundary, all three of those were created because I had my service types defined in three separate fields. Okay. Now you might ask, well, I don't, so what do I do? If I don't have that, but I have ESZs, how can I go ahead and build those data sets? So if you go back to your course prep, I did provide some scenarios in here. So maybe you already have ESBs. And in that case, you wouldn't need to worry about using that tool to create new ones. Okay, because it's kind of a moot point. If you already have them, you don't need to create them. So you would just kind of skip that and go right to the ESB field mapping, which is here within the toolkit. Okay. If all of your service types are in one field, so you have one field called service type or something, and you've got 60 different records with a mix of fire law and EMS, then what you would do is select by the service type and export into individual feature classes. Okay, and once you do that, then you could go through that field mapping effort for each individual ESB. If you don't know what the service type is, or if you don't have any ESZs, then I would definitely work with your PSAP, like we talked about earlier, to go ahead and create and define those. All right. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So this is a good point to pause the recording and work through this on your own. And we are going to continue to move on by populating those mandatory fields. So what we're going to do is actually switch to the geodatabase called OK Standards Data Initial. And what this is a geodatabase where essentially the geodatabase itself is standards compliant. Okay, it's got the appropriate coordinate system, it has the domain set, it has the feature data set here for NG911, and within it we have all of our required layers with the appropriate schema. So if I go in and look at my address points, I have standards compliant names. The same with my road center lines. My schema is standards compliant. But remember, I told you earlier that when we talk about completeness, there's different levels to this. Having all of the layers is one of those. Making sure that you have all the fields is the second one. The third one is making sure that those fields are populated, which is where we're at. I mean, you can create as many fields as you want, but if they're not populated, then they're not compliant. Okay, just because you have a field called revision editor, if that field is not populated, then it's not compliant because it's mandatory. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and populate some of those mandatory values. Okay. So we're working in that second geodatabase now called Standards Data Initial. And you can see that here in your student guide, and that's on page 6. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open ArcMap. And it always takes my ArcMap a moment to open. I apologize. And I'm going to go ahead and add in from my standards data initial. I'm going to add in my road center lines. and my fire ESB. Okay, just going to drop those in. What I need to do next is I'm going to, well, first, let me turn this off so I can show you guys how to access this. So if you don't know how to access your editing toolbar, you're going to right click up here in the gray space within ArcMap, and you're going to turn on your editing toolbar. Okay. You can field calculate outside of an editing session. I just have always been, I'm an old GIS person. I've been in the habit of going into an editing session to field calculate. That's just what I do. You guys can do it however you want. But when we talk about field calculating, what we mean is that we are looking at an entire field. It could be 10,000 records, it could be 10, and we're going to update the values in that field using a simple calculation. That's at its simplest what a field calculation is. Okay. So I'm going to do my ESB first. I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to choose Open Attribute Table so that I can see those attributes there. And I'm going to populate the following fields. I'm going to populate my agency ID, my discrepancy agency ID. Okay. I'm also going to populate my NGU ID, but that's a separate tool, and I'll show you that here in just a few minutes. Okay. But for the ESB fire boundaries, I'm just going to do the agency ID and the discrepancy agency ID. Okay. Now, for the purpose of this exercise, we are going to assume that this is the same ID for both, and I'll explain what that is here in just a moment. But what we do to field calculate is when we're looking at the attribute table, we click up here on the field name to highlight the field in blue. We're going to right click and choose the field calculator. Any field calculation that you do has to be well, for something like this, it needs to be in double quotes. So I'm going to type cog.acog.ok.gov and close it with the quotes, and I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to do the same thing over here for the agency ID. cog.acog.ok.gov, because I already had it calculated for the previous field. It just shows there. So I'm going to click OK. Make it easy on myself. Now, the agency ID and discrepancy agency ID could potentially be different depending on your individual situation. Okay. So one particular scenario would be you are a larger county and maybe you have 3 smaller municipalities who handle their own GIS, but they say, you know what? I don't care about this NG911 stuff. I don't really want to bother with it. Can you guys just submit the data on our behalf? And as the discrepancy agency, you can say, yeah, we can do that. So that's where you would end up effectively with 2 different IDs. Your municipalities would have a separate ID, then you would have your own. Okay. Now remember, the discrepancy agency has a very important role. Okay. You are submitting data to the state repository, which is going to go on and be provisioned into the EasyNet. You're submitting that data. You're also receiving back the report. Okay, so whenever you submit the data, it goes through its own series of checks and balances. A report is generated and sent back to the discrepancy agency saying, hey, here's all the places where we found anomalies. And then it's up to you as the discrepancy agency to correct those or see that they get corrected and turn around in time. Okay. That's why it's called the discrepancy agency, because you're the one handling any discrepancies that come out of that process. Now, if you do your own editing as the discrepancy agency, then your discrepancy and agency ID are probably going to be one and the same. But like I said, you can choose to enter into an agreement with another locality to submit data on their behalf. But as the discrepancy agency, it is your responsibility to make sure that that data, any anomalies, get corrected, even if they don't occur within your specific locality. If you're entering into that agreement, you assume that responsibility. Okay. So we've populated the discrepancy agency and the agency for the fire ESB. I'm going to open my road centerline attribute table, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm first going to go ahead and populate the discrepancy agency ID. So that's going to be the same thing, cog.acog.ok.gov. And by the way, you can get this list from the state. They can provide that to you if you don't know what your agency ID is. And then I'm going to scroll all the way over here and I'm going to populate my agency ID. Again, it's going to be the same thing. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is populate my my country field and my state field. Okay. So if let's see here. There we go. Okay. So for the state, often you see this happen where people are not using best practices for data editing. You know, they might not be using, you know, database, you know how it is. They're not using database standards and things like that. So the good thing about having the domains is that the domains can really assist with helping you standardize your data, okay, and preventing things like this from happening. So I'm going to highlight the state field and I'm going to click the field calculator and I'm going to type OK and then click OK. And you can see here that it changed that entire field to the appropriate fully spelled out domain value. Okay. And then similarly, if we had any for United States, if you just typed in US, it would work for that as well. I thought I had a field that had that populated, but maybe I'm imagining things. It's only been like a week since I taught this class live, so it's possible that I'm losing it. It's always a good possibility. But anyway, so those would be the fields that you would want to populate, okay? The other field I'm going to populate here is going to be the agency, and the agency is going to be ACOG. That's my agency for this exercise. So let me scroll over. And it'll probably be one that I miss because I have a habit of missing fields. Agency ID. Glad you guys get to see me be lost on a recording. That's good. At least you're getting to know the schema this way. Okay, let me see what's going on here. Sometimes when you stare at something so long, oh wait, I'm doing it in reverse. Here we go. This is the problem. I'm looking for a field that doesn't exist in that file. Yeah, here we go, agency. That's helpful. So going back to our fire ESBs, it's all in your document. It's all in your document. I'm going to populate that field with ACOG and click OK. So we've populated the agency ID, the discrepancy agency ID, and then the agency itself, okay, in the FHIR ESBs. This is what I was looking for earlier. So in our country field, when I go to the field calculator, if I type in US here, you can see here what happens. It gives me the fully spelled out country name. Similarly, when I do the same for the state, so when again, you have to close it in quotes, I can just type the state abbreviation and click OK, and then it fully spells out the state name. Okay. Sorry, that was a little disjointed there, guys. I got the directions wrong on my copy. But this would be a good time to pause so that you can go ahead and work through that. And that is going to be on page 6. So you'll want to open ArcMap, bring in your road center lines and your FHIR ESBs from the second geodatabase called Standards Data Initial. And you'll also want to go through and populate those fields just like we did. So for FHIR, you'll want to do country, state, agency ID, and the agency, also the discrepancy agency ID. And then in the road center lines, you'll want to take care of the agency ID and the discrepancy agency ID. Hold off on doing the NGU ID or the legacy fields for just a moment, and we will come back to that. Okay. So after we have these fields populated here, it's time to run through the next tool for assign the unique NINA ID. So let's talk about that for just a second, okay? Every single feature class within your geodatabase is going to have a field for the NGU ID, all right? And it's always going to start with NGU ID, then it's going to be underscore, and then the layer name that corresponds to that particular field, okay? So if I bounce back over to the standard real quick, I can take a look at this with you and we can talk this through. So this is just for the road center line schema. So for the NGU ID, what that means, that means it's the NINA or the National Emergency Number Association Globally Unique ID. That's what NGU ID stands for, NINA Globally Unique ID, okay? And what this is this is a truly unique ID for every single feature within your geodatabase, okay? So if you have a segment, of Main Street, that's gonna have its own NGU ID. If you have 50 segments of Main Street, you're going to have 50 different NGU IDs. It's not one unique ID per street name or per boundary. It's per feature, okay, or record. So if you have 6 FHIR ESBs, then you're going to have 6 individual NGU IDs for those FHIR ESBs. All right. That NGU ID consists of the layer name, an underscore, a numeric unique ID, or it could be alphanumeric, however you're maintaining it if you have a local unique ID. And then it's got the @agency ID, which you already have populated within ArcMap here. So I have my agency ID here. Now, the reason that you have the agency ID, that's to uniquely identify every agency within your state. The thing is that your agency ID is also going to be unique at a national level. So remember from B1 that the goal of NG911 is to have a nationwide system. So when my PSAP in Virginia fails, your PSAP in Oklahoma could route calls for me. That's the point, okay? And because the GIS data is feeding the NG911 system, you want everything to be truly unique, Okay, so think about county names. We have a Frederick County, Virginia, which is where I live. There's also a Frederick County, Maryland, which is like 40 minutes up the road from me. There's a Washington County, Florida. There's a Washington County, Washington. There's a Washington County, Oklahoma. There's an Escambia County, Alabama. There's an Escambia County, Florida. So you have a lot of these overlapping county names that are duplicate nationwide. Similarly, street names. Think about how many main streets there are in the United States. So you really do need to have an ID that is unique. And what this comes back to again is that error reporting. Okay, so that the EZNet can properly identify not only the anomaly that's occurring within that data or the discrepancy, but it can identify the appropriate agency to return that anomaly. You know, so it knows that Main Street in Washington County, Oklahoma, it's not going to go to Main Street in Washington County, Florida. That's the purpose of having this long domain name here. Okay, so that's what the NGUID is. Now, a lot of you might be saying, look, I already have a unique ID on my data. And that's fine. And I would encourage you to incorporate the NGUID into your SDE or into your enterprise level geodatabase, because it's going to help you correct things at the top and work your way down, which is really what you want. Okay. And again, I would reference that flow chart because you can maintain your NGUID within your SDE non-compliant. You just have to make sure that you've got the field in there for the agency ID, okay, and the NGUID field. So let's go ahead and work through that example of how to assign a unique NINA ID within these different feature classes, okay? So I'm going to go back to ARC catalog, and I'm going to, from my enhancement tools, I'm going to choose Assign Unique NINA ID. For my layer name, I'm going to choose Road Centerline. My feature class is going to be in my second geodatabase, because that's the one we're working in now. It's already standards compliant. I'm going to choose the Road Centerline feature class. I'm going to point it to the appropriate unique ID field, which is the NGUID _ RDCL. And then I'm going to provide my agency ID, which is at the bottom here. Now, let me move this to the side and pull up the standard so that you can see the concatenation that takes place. Okay. I just want you to be able to identify this and see what's going on. So what this is doing is saying, hey, let's make an ID using this name within this feature class in this field, and then I'm going to append the agency ID. So you can really see the concatenation that's occurring through this tool. Now, if you wanted to do this outside of a standards compliant data set, and you had a unique ID locally that you're using that you want to drop in here, you can do that. Okay, and again, I would reference that flow chart that the developers provided, because that's going to give you a lot of really good information about where to start if you wanted to incorporate that into your own data. All right. You can choose to overwrite all if you want to. I don't necessarily recommend doing that unless you've done a lot of editing and you're at a place where you feel comfortable overwriting. What I will tell you to be mindful about is making sure that you stay mindful as you're editing your data. So when you're copying, address points that largely have the same attributes, make sure you change that NGUID, because this is not going to do that for you automatically. That's still going to be a very manual process through editing that you're going to have to take care of. Okay. When you are splitting and merging road center lines, you need to be mindful of the unique ID. Okay. Because it's not going to update it on its own. you're going to have to take care of that. All right, so just be mindful as you're editing your data, how the changes that you're making are affecting the attributes. Okay, you have to look at these things holistically. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. Oh, yeah, and if that ever happens, it's probably because you're in an editing session. So let's try to run that again. There we go. And if I pop back over to my ArcMap, I can open my road center lines and see that my NGUID has been assigned. Okay, that's for every record, 567 records. And I'm going to do the same thing on my fire ESBs. This is a mandatory field. You absolutely have to have this populated. It's critical. NGUID, and then populate the agency ID. Now, because this tool is concatenating different fields together, you do need to make sure that you have that agency ID populated. If your NGUID is calculated and it looks funky or it doesn't look correct at all, it's probably because you didn't have your agency ID populated. Okay. I'm going to go back here and open, and I can see here that my NGUID for my fire boundary has been created. All right. So this is a time when you would probably want to pause and run through that assigning the unique NINA ID. And that's going to be on page 7. So I would go ahead and pause now and work through that. And we're going to keep moving on to the fixed street type and direction. Okay. So fixed street type and direction, let's take a look at this for a second. If I take a look at my road center line data, let me show you this first. Most of us are currently maintaining fields that look like this, right? So for our pre-directionals, we're using abbreviated values for those directionals, NSEW. Our roads are also abbreviated, right? So you can have your street type abbreviated or your directional suffix, and that's how we're currently maintaining our data today. Well, in the standard, if you look, the fields actually have to be unabbreviated. Okay. So you can't use NSEW. You have to spell out north, south, east, and west. Okay. Similarly, you're going to have to spell out boulevard and circle, terrace, highway, etc. All right. Those have to be unabbreviated, and it says that right there in the standard. And not to get into this again, but this was kind of explained in B1 about why that happens. It's because of that exchange of information that occurs during the 911 call. Okay, we need to have unabbreviated values for that information exchange. All right. Now you might be saying, well, what about all my applications like my CAD system that still use those abbreviated values? And that's okay, because what we have here are legacy fields. All right, so you definitely want to continue maintaining the legacy fields. Those are going to maintain what we would call old format, what you're doing right now with the abbreviated. See here, it says abbreviated direction, abbreviated street type. All right. So just because you're currently maintaining data with abbreviated values doesn't mean you have to lose that. It just means that you move those into different fields. All right. And there's a tool to help you. So what we want to do is open the adjustment tools. And the tool we're looking for is the fixed street type and direction. So what this is going to do is it's going to convert the legacy abbreviations, so anything that's abbreviated, and spell them out to the unabbreviated standards compliant values. And optionally, which I would say definitely do this, you can check the boxes to move the values from those fields into the legacy field so they remain abbreviated. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. In my road center lines that I just showed you guys, I've got abbreviated values here, right? And then if I scroll all the way down, I have legacy fields. They're currently null because I don't have any values there, obviously, but we're going to run the tool and see the results that we get. So again, this is an adjustment tool. It's fixed street type and direction. I'm going to point it to my, again, we're in the second geodatabase called standards data initial. I'm going to provide the road center line. For street type field, I'm going to choose street type. For the directional prefix, I'm going to choose predir. And for the directional suffix, I'm going to choose my suffdir field. I am going to check the boxes because I want my abbreviated values to be transformed into those or calculated into those legacy values. So I'm going to click OK. And this runs pretty quickly, actually. So now when I'm actually going to look at this in ArcMap, and I'll show you what this looks like. So I'm going to open here. You see here, my pre-directionals have been spelled out. The same with my street type and my suffix directionals, if I had them. Okay. Now, if I scroll over to my legacy fields, I know y'all are thinking, well, you told me it was going to be abbreviated, and it is. Let me show you. If I go to my table options button, which is at the upper left of my attribute table, and I click and choose appearance, I'm going to check off the box to display the coded value domain and subtype descriptions. And you can see there that the values are abbreviated. Okay. So that is a really handy tool for standardizing the data that's supposed to be spelled out to meet compliance, and also transferring those abbreviated values into the legacy values. All right. So that's at the bottom of page 7. So go ahead and run through, and you're just going to need to do that for the road center lines. And we're going to move on to the fixed domain case. So fixed domain case will adjust any data with domain values. If it's got a mixed case, like a lowercase, or if it's mixed, then it will change that to upper. Okay, and again, this is really good for QC and standardization, and this is a very fast tool to run. All right. So I'm going to close this, but this is also an adjustment tool. So I'm going to open the fixed domain case. Before I do that, I'm going to show you an example of that. I kind of already showed you this earlier about how people will use, let's see here if I can, yeah, it may not work. It's on state. Here we go. How some people will not use the best practices for database management to populate data, okay? So this particular tool is actually going to be ran at the geodatabase level. So it's going to look at all the fields, and wherever there's a domain applied, it's going to transfer or transform the lower or mixed case into all uppercase. So I'm going to open fixed domain. I'm going to choose my second geodatabase and click add, and then I'm going to click OK. And now let's take a look at that again. See? All values in that field have been translated to all uppercase. And that is at the bottom of page 8. And we are going to move on. If you'd like to pause the recording now, that would be a good time if you want to run that tool. But we are going to move on to the calculate parity. That's at the bottom of page 9. So let's talk about parity for a sec. The parity fields are required. They're mandatory values within the road center lines, okay? And parity refers to even or odd on the left or right side of the street, basically. Okay, and it uses the range values, I believe, to calculate the parity. So let's take a look at that. Oops. I'm going to open the calculate parity field. First, I can actually show you that those fields are not populated. See, parity left and parity right. And again, if you ever have any questions about what something means, go back to the standard. If you're like, what is parity? What even is that? It's right here in the standard, okay? And you can see that it's mandatory and that there is a domain associated with it. But we have this tool that's going to help us, okay? So it's an enhancement tool. I'm going to open the tool for calculate parity, and I'm going to provide it the road center line feature class within the second geodatabase because we're still working in that one. And I'm going to click OK and just let that run. And it may have popped up and I missed it, but if that happens to you, you can always go check the results. So you go to geoprocessing and our catalog, then to results, current session, and then calculate parity. So it succeeded. It was just super duper fast and I missed it. I was looking at another screen. But I'm going to take a look here just to make sure. See, parity left and parity right have both been calculated. And that's at the bottom of page 9. So if you want to pause, this would be a good time. Go ahead and run that tool. And we can calculate, or talk about fixed MSAG COM spaces. I'm not going to run that because we did not calculate in any anomalies for MSAG COM spaces, but basically this is one that you would run at the geodatabase level, and this is going to remove leading and trailing spaces from all of those MSAG COM fields. Okay, so it's going to take out any leading and trailing spaces. That's a super fast tool to run, and that is going to be in the adjustment tools. So you would just point it to the geodatabase and then let it run. It's super fast, but like I said, we didn't build in any anomalies there for that, so I can't show you any results. But just be advised, if you have leading or trailing spaces in those fields, this tool is going to take care of that for you. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to calculate label. And this is a really important one that I want to talk about, okay? What this is this is a field that's located within the road center lines and the address point feature classes, okay? And I'll show you the field. So right now it's null, okay? But what the calculate label field does is it concatenates all of those, well, I can just pull up the document and show you. Let me pull up the README real quick. So it calculates the label from the following fields. And again, if you're ever curious about what functionality this tool has included with it, or any of the tools, go back to the README. Okay, this is actually a pretty significant process to run, because it is required for some of the other geoprocessing operations within this toolkit. Okay. So if you want to look at address range overlaps, you have to have the label calculated. If you want to generate fish bones, you have to have the label calculated, okay? And those are two really powerful tools that you don't want to miss out on, and you really should have those calculated. And so, like before, when we said this isn't a wizard, it is true that it's not, but you can see there is kind of a sequence of events that occurs. Like, you know, you need to have certain fields populated before you can run something. You know, for example, you need to have your agency ID populated before you can calculate the NGU ID. You need to have the label calculated before you can run fish bones or find address range overlaps. So although within the standard, the label is optional, I would say that if you want to leverage those tools within the toolkit, then calculate it, okay? But the calculate label is going to use these fields to perform the calculation and generate a new label, okay? So it's not labeling in the sense of, oh, it's creating a brand new label for your maps. No, it's not like that at all. You could use it for that, but those are going to be the NINA values. So you're going to have a super duper long label. You're going to have the fully spelled out pre-directional, the fully spelled out street type, etc. So you have to decide if that's something that you want to go with. But let's go ahead and run the tool, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to open calculate label, and I'm going to choose my road center lines from my second geodatabase. I'm going to add that there and click OK. And it calculates pretty quickly. So I'm going to open my road center lines and take a look at that field. See? Bam. Like I said, it's using the fully spelled out values, okay? So y'all may not want to use this for your actual map labeling. If you have another field for label, I would keep it, especially if you're using the abbreviated values. But I just wanted you guys to know that, you know, this is really important to run those other tools. Now, the thing is, is that if you're doing a lot of editing with your addresses, think about it, okay? Remember that the labeling tool is actually concatenating all of these fields together. So if you're doing a lot of editing and if any of these attributes change, then you're going to need to recalculate that label. So again, being mindful as you're going through your editing, thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to have to be mindful about my NGUID. I'm going to have to be mindful about my calculate label. You know, think about these things that you're going to need to update as you're going through and editing your data. You definitely want to make sure that you have, that after you do any major editing with these fields or any editing at all, if you want to go through and you want to run these tools, make sure you recalculate. Okay. And this can also be done, you would also do this within your address points. So I'll show you that field. So within your address points, you're also going to have that label field calculated, or it's going to be there in the data. See? And furthermore, I can go ahead and run it for that if you guys want to see that. It's pretty fast. Okay. And you'll want to calculate that for both before you go through any of those other geoprocessing tools. So this would be a good time to pause, but before you do that, I just want to point out that you only need to calculate it for this exercise. We only had you do it for the road center lines, and that is going to be at the bottom of page 11. Okay, so our next step, because we're moving on, we're going to add and validate the NG911 topology. Okay. So what this is it's going to generate a topology and allow us to visually see any anomalies within the GIS data. All right. And I'll show you what that looks like. And for those of you who don't know what a topology is, a topology, a very simplistic explanation of topology is really refers to the relationships of features between themselves. Okay, so road center line to road center line, or feature class to feature class. So saying all address points must be totally within my discrepancy agency boundary. Okay, so it can be between features themselves within a feature class, or it can be between other feature classes. Okay, so let's take a look at the README real quick. What's going on here when you run this is the data is examined in light of these different rules that have been set by the developers. Okay, and these rules are specifically addressing certain things that you would not want within your GIS data. So we're setting these rules and we're saying, okay, if you violate a particular rule, then we're going to flag that as an error or an anomaly. All right, so for example, it says for polygon layers, all polygon feature classes must not overlap. Okay. You must not have gaps between your ESBs and your PSAP. There are these different rules that apply to road center lines, like dangles. Okay. And then you can see here that the discrepancy agency, now remember earlier we said that the discrepancy agency is essentially your geofence. That's your area of responsibility for the data that you maintain. Okay. So there are a lot of rules associated with the discrepancy agency boundary. So for example, address points have to be inside that boundary. Road center lines have to be inside. Your ESBs, your ESZs, and your PSAPs, they all have to cover each other. Okay, so you can't have any gaps between any of those boundaries and the discrepancy agency. All right, so if you're ever confused about why something is flagging as an error or why something looks the way that it does, then you would definitely want to reference this, because the more you go back and forth between the README and your data, it's going to make more sense to you. Okay, and then like I said, if you get super stuck, you know, you can give one of the state folks a call to try to get some more clarity there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run the topology. Now I will tell you, if you have ArcMap open, you will want to close that, because the topology will crash and the tool won't run if you already have ArcMap open. ArcCatalog is okay. That's how I like to run this tool. All right. So the add and validate NG9-1 topology is an enhancement tool. So you'll want to open that tool and just point it to the geodatabase. And we are still using the second geodatabase for this part of the exercise. So just choose the second one, click add, and you do want to check the box to validate the topology. I'm going to click OK and let that run. Okay. And you can see that does take a moment, but that's okay. Now, be mindful, this is a smaller, very controlled data set that we're using here in class. So I would say that on your own data, you know, be mindful of the size. And if you have a bigger data set, you know, maybe you want to set this up to run before lunch or before you go home at the end of the day, because it may take a lot of time if you have a large data set, okay? So you can see here that a new topology was created within my geodatabase. So I'm going to go ahead and open ArcMap. And I'm going to bring that topology in and we'll take a look at it. So what I'm going to do is open my second geodatabase. And I'm going to add that topology. And then it's going to say, hey, do you also want to add all the feature classes that participate in this topology, which is basically everything. Because remember, the rules in the README are looking at basically every single thing in relationship to one another. So I'm going to say, okay, sure, why not? And it brings in all of my feature classes. Now, if you said no, then it's just going to bring in the anomalies here that you see in red. All right. Now, I will tell you that this is where, some more advanced GIS skills come in, because if you've never worked with topologies before, this can be kind of intimidating. But basically just be advised that everything that's shown in red is an error. That's something that violates the rules that were outlined in the README that we just looked at. All right. So just to recap, this is my discrepancy agency boundary. Okay. Within it, I have my ESBs. Okay, which largely overlap one another, but they don't overlap the discrepancy agency. They don't fill it out all the way. I have my PSAP. I also have my road center lines and my address points. So that's why it's super helpful to have, I like to have these in here because you can kind of toggle them on and off and kind of look at and understand, why something might be flagging. Sometimes, just by looking at this in and of itself, it's not super helpful. So it is good to bring in your other feature classes as well. Now, I will tell you that you will need to turn on, or I recommend that you turn on your topology toolbar and your editing toolbar. And just a reminder of how to do that, you would right click in the gray space, turn on editor, and then right click and turn on topology. If y'all were with me in person in Oklahoma when I was there a few weeks ago, this was my toolbar that ran away. It was like floating here in Virginia somewhere. I couldn't get it to come up when I was in person with you guys. But it's here now. So in order to use the error inspector, which is what we're going to look at, we do need to be in an editing session. Okay. And remember, folks, this is just the geometry anomalies that it's looking at. This isn't anything having to do with the attribute table. This is just looking at the geometry of those feature classes. So I'm going to turn on my editing. And there is a button here on the topology toolbar that says Error Inspector. So when I click that, I have a couple options here. I can choose to see what's only in the visible extent. Well, my visible extent is basically all of my data. So if I click Search Now, that's going to bring up all of the errors identified through that topology process. So I have 237 errors. All right. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to look at, again, all of those, I guess you would call it, rule violations in terms of the geometry. So for my road center lines, it's telling me I have all these dangles, right? That's where these little dots are coming in. So you can just kind of go through and select each one and just kind of take a look at it and examine it. Okay. And look at it and say, all right, why is this happening? Oh, okay, because it's saying that that's a dangle. All right. So it tells you what the rule is that was violated and then the feature class in which that occurs. All right. Must be properly inside. What does that mean? Looky here. So this is an area. Wow. Holy zoom out, Batman. This is an area where we have our discrepancy agency boundary. And then we have some address points. Now, this is my kind of favorite scenario to talk about here, okay? Because this is a very real situation that we come across. I had it here when I worked in local government here in Virginia. We deal with this with our clients. So it is possible that, sometimes you may have structures that are, let's call this yellow area PSAP A and the white area PSAP B. You may have structures that are physically located in one PSAP, but are accessed through another. And in this case, the only right-of-way comes through PSAP A. And if someone from PSAP A can get there in 10 minutes versus someone from PSAP B can get there in 25 minutes, wouldn't it make more sense for PSAP A to be the responding agent, even if those people pay taxes in PSAP B, I don't care. If you find yourself continually doing transfers in an area like this, then maybe you need to look at why that is, and maybe look at adjusting your call routing boundaries. This is a perfect scenario of when you would want to bring in, well, really, you want to have your PSAP engaged at all stages of your boundary development and refinement. But this is a perfect example of that, because the guys who are responding can say, look, we have an elderly gentleman here, and he has, all these health issues, and he's a fall risk, and we always have to come out and help him. And we always get calls transferred to us because even though they're located in PSAP B, it's actually very fast for us to get there. We can get there in 5 minutes because, maybe our fire station is like up here somewhere. Whereas in PSAP B, the fire station's way out here, and they've got to come into this county and then go back around to get to that structure. So this is a perfect example of a situation where you would want to say, okay, we need to give our call routing boundary some thought. Who should get the call first based on the response? Who's the appropriate responding agency based on what we know about the area, the scenario, what's being experienced? Okay. And so for me, this would be an opportunity to get both PSAPs in the room with the GIS folks and say, let's talk this out. Let's think about this from a call routing perspective, not a legislative perspective. Okay, so for many of us, our discrepancy agency boundaries are going to follow our county boundaries. Okay, I'm not saying that that's a best practice. That's how a lot of people start out because, hey, it's already something that you have, right? Most of us already have our county boundary. So let's just start with that. Because in most cases, you're going to keep in your county. But in situations like this, you're going to need to make some more difficult decisions, and you're going to need to think through some of these decisions before you make a final call on that boundary. So what would I do in this situation? I would get everybody in the same room, and I would say, look, folks, this is the reality of the situation. Okay, we have a guy here y'all are continually responding to. There's transfers in this area. Let's go ahead and adjust that call routing boundary to make it reflect what's going on in real life. So that way, when in NG9-1 environment, we're getting the appropriate responding agency, and we're not having transfer calls, because transferring adds time. Again, that adds time. Seconds matter, right? So I don't want to beat that horse to death, but because I'm looking here at a rule violation, I did want to explain that. Okay, so what this is doing is it's saying, yeah, I mean, you've got these structures here that are outside of the PSAP boundary. Yeah, they're going to flag as an anomaly because they're outside. So how would you rectify that? Well, you would either A, delete them all together. If you say, no, I don't want anything to do with this, this isn't us, we shouldn't respond to this. Or the best thing to do would be to adjust that call routing boundary to encompass those structures and that street. Okay, so this is how you can use the error inspector to look through those different errors to determine what's going on. Okay, and this will also take you some time. This will also take you some time. Now, in the case of the must cover each other, that is specifically relating to the fact that you have a discrepancy agency boundary here, and your ESBs do not fully encompass that boundary. So you have areas within your discrepancy agency boundary where you've got no coverage, which isn't good. You need to have full coverage. And again, go back to the README if you have any questions. Okay. All right, so this would be a good place to pause so that you can run through this yourself and kind of look through the data. And again, that is going to be on page 12. Okay, so we're going to move on to fix submit, and that's going to be page 13. Let's take a look at that submit field. The submit field is included in every feature class within that schema, okay? And the submit field is specific to the toolkit. And what this field does, you can see this is a mandatory field, so it's either going to be a yes or no. That's the domain, yes, no. What the submit field does is it tells the toolkit, hey, yeah, I want to submit this for validation, or no, I don't. You're either going to submit something for validation or you're not. All right. Now, there are circumstances where you may not want to, okay? And I would say that, you know, if you have areas where you've just started drawing in, you know, maybe you have a subdivision and, you know, you have the geometry in, but there's someone else who's responsible for populating the attributes like the ranges and, you know, all this other type of stuff, stuff that would be mandatory. And if you don't have that information yet, you might want to go ahead and mark that as a no because it's not ready to be submitted yet. Okay, like that would be a really good example of something where, you know, you just started drawing it in, you don't have all the info, but you don't want something that's incomplete to flag errors within your data. So you're going to go ahead and mark that as a no, and you're going to continue working on that. And then through the next submission, you're going to go ahead and run this tool again. Okay. So this is a yes or no. So let me show you that field. Right here. See, it's currently null because we haven't done any population yet. This is an adjustment tool. So we'll expand the adjustment tools and we will open fix submit. And we're going to run this on the whole geodatabase just because, you know, you're submitting the geodatabase to the state. So I think it's easier in this case to mark everything as a yes to submit because the ones that you're not going to submit, that's going to be kind of managing by exception. So I would go ahead and populate everything to submit, but then go back and manage those exceptions that you're gonna mark. Okay. So I'm going to add that and click OK. Pesky. See? Stop editing. I'm going to close out of my ArcMap. If you ever get any errors or if it crashes, then just close out of your ArcMap and it should run. Okay, and that was super fast. Again, that tool is just doing a very quick field calculation through every feature class. So if I scroll over again, it's marked with a Y. Okay. So this one is going to be at the bottom of page 13, and this would be a good place to pause the recording so that you can go ahead and do that. All right, so we're going to move on. We are going to populate or field calculate the GeoMSAG left and GeoMSAG right fields, okay? And you can see the notes in the student guide that the fields are directly correlated to a locality's MSAG and the submit field. So if you're marking something for submission, then it should have a corresponding GeoMSAG left and right field populated. All right. And again, we are still waiting on those MSAG tools. I think with this latest release, they're out. but we are not showing you those in this course. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open ArcMap again. And the GeoMSAG left and right, and again, we can bounce back to the schema here, to the standard. The GeoMSAG left and right are here in the standard, and you can see that those are mandatory fields, okay, for the road center lines. So we're going to go ahead and add in those road center lines. Second geodatabase still. I'm going to start an editing session. And I'm going to open my attribute table and navigate to those fields, which are at the very end, I believe. Yep. And really what we're looking for here is we're just going to populate that with a Y. And that's going to be just like we did for the road center lines and the fire ESBs earlier that we field calculated. So remember, anytime you're doing a field calculation, you want to close that value with the double quote. And it's already populated, so I can just click OK here. And that's that. Okay. Now you're like, well, why? What is the point? It's required. And actually, if you go back to the README, this is another one of those kind of can be kind of a gotcha. If you want to find the address range overlap, those fields are required. Okay. They are required anyway within the standard, but if you don't have it populated, you won't be able to run the find address range overlap tool, which is a really cool tool. I want you guys to be able to use that. So, you know, we want to make sure that you have all of these populated as best you can so that you can run some of these, because this is really going to go a long way in helping you get your data QC'd and cleaned up. All right. Okay, so I'm going to close out of this. This would be a good time to pause and go ahead and do that field calculation. Again, that was on the GeoMSAG left and right fields. And for the next part of this exercise, we are going to switch to the final geodatabase, which is the standards data prepped. Okay, I will show you what that looks like. So if you look in the standards data prepped, this is our fully compliant geodatabase. So it's going to have the correct coordinate system. It's got the domain set. It has the feature data set that we need, which is that NG911. It also has all of our required layers. Additionally, all of the mandatory fields have been populated. So in the previous one, we had the schema, but not all the fields were populated. In this one, all of those fields are populated. Okay, so we are ready at this point to run some of those tools that are really going to be beneficial in helping us identify, besides the topology, which was super useful for those geographical kind of errors or anomalies. We're now going to be able to run some tools that are also going to help us look at the attributes and even more of the geometry aspect of our data. All right. So that's going to be at the, yes, that's going to be at the bottom of page 13, that populate GeoMSAG left and right. So we are going to go into the fixed topo accept, but before we do that, okay, I am going to show you an example of something here. And for just a moment, and I shouldn't have closed my window before, but oh well. I am going to briefly bring back in that topology from the previous geodatabase. We looked at. So this is from the second one. We don't have a topology in the third. But I did want to show you something because this is something that we do need to talk about, okay? Some things are not really errors, right? Some things like what are marked as dangles are actually real streets. So if I zoom in, you can see here that all of these have been marked with a dangle. It identified this as a dangle. So this was a violation of one of those rules where you can't have dangles. But we know that we all have streets like this in our community, right? Where they're either dead ends or they're cul-de-sacs. And those are very real things within our data, and they're not actually errors, okay? So if I open up the standard again, I can show you that there is, here we go, it's at the bottom. For the road center lines specifically, there is a field called topo accept, okay? And it only exists within the road center lines. It's called topo accept, and it is a mandatory field. And what this field is for you to mark an exception within your road center lines if something is an exception to the rule. So something is either an exception or it isn't, okay? And if it isn't, then it goes through, it gets validated just like anything else. If it comes out an error, then you need to fix it if you're saying it's not an exception. If it is an exception, then it's not looked at as an error, all right? For example, all of these are shown as dangles. But what I can do is start an editing session, and I can go through and select, and I have available to me this topo accept field. Again, this is only in the road center lines. This is the only place where you can mark exceptions. Okay, you can't do it on any other layer. So within the topo accept, I have, and this is a domain field, I have a few possibilities here. So I can annotate within my attribute table that it's either an exception to the must not have dangles. So you can see here it's flagging as a dangle because it's got that little point at the end of the street. It's an exception to the must be inside the discrepancy agency boundary. It's an exception to both of those, or it's not an exception at all. So in the case of this particular street, this is an exception to the must not have dangles, okay? And the same is going to be true for this one. So I can basically go through, and this is going to be part of that cleanup process to help you, get some of this stuff cleaned up, because you don't want this stuff flagging over and over and over again. That's why I say, this might be beneficial to put some of these into your SDE, if you're, depending on how you have this whole thing set up and how you're going to arrange this going forward, this is something where you'll want to kind of start at the top, okay? So you would do that for all of these. Now, let me go back to that previous example that we looked at. So let's take a look at this road center line here. Not only does this extend outside of our discrepancy agency, but it is also a dangle. So this is going to be an exception to both of those. All right. And, the thing here is that a lot of you are maintaining road center lines that extend outside of your county boundary, and you're doing that for your CAD system, and that's okay. This is where you would go along your boundary and you would mark those exceptions, because they are going to flag as errors if you do not. So where it says, topo except, I'm going to choose it's an exception to both because it does extend outside of my discrepancy agency boundary, but because it appears to dead end, it also is flagged as a point error because of being a dangle. Okay. So remember, you can only mark exceptions on your road center lines. Okay. The thing is that I can go through this effort and what's going to end up happening is I'm going to have my topo except is going to have the ones that I've marked as an exception. So I might have, some dangles. I might have, dangle exceptions or outside of the discrepancy agency exceptions. I might have a bunch of these, but then I have all these null values. Now, the question I have for you is, can you have a mandatory field with null values or blanks? The answer is that anything that's mandatory must be populated. You have to populate the field. You cannot have nulls or blanks in a mandatory field. Okay? So the solution here is to make sure that this entire field is populated. Okay? And I'll show you that because there's a tool for that. So you're really going to go through and you're going to mark your exceptions. Then your next step would be to run the fixed topo except tool. Because what this is going to do is allow you to say, okay, well, something is either an exception or it's not. Okay, so the exceptions we've already gone through and we've marked. Now we have to deal with the ones that are not an exception that we need to just go ahead and run through the process and clean up. Okay, and how do we handle populating that field going forward? So what you're going to want to do is run the fixed topo except tool. So I am going to close this at this point, and I'm going to open the fixed topo except. That's an adjustment tool. So I'm going to open that tool. I'm going to input, and again, we are now working in the third geodatabase for the standards data prepped. So I'm going to go into my third geodatabase and choose my road center lines. It automatically detects the topo except field. I have some dangle exceptions, so I'm just going to provide the dangle exception. And then I'm going to update the null values to no exception. So basically what this is going to do is it's going to say, okay, well, I see you have some exceptions, but when I check this box, anything that's null is going to be transformed to no exception. That's how it's going to be populated. And I'm going to click OK, and I'll show you what that looks like. Remember, this is only for the road center lines. You can't do the exceptions in any other feature class but the road center lines. So the easiest thing I can do to describe this is just tell you that something is either going to be an exception or it isn't. And if it isn't, then it has to be populated because you cannot have anything in there that is a null because it's a mandatory field. So see here, we have some exceptions. And these look a little bit different than the ones that we just marked. That's because this is a different geodatabase, but we did introduce some exceptions here. And then what the tool did was it acknowledged these exceptions and then populated the rest of the null values to say it's not an exception to the rule. So what that means is that the next time the data is validated, these are going to be ignored and not flagged again as dangles, but these are going to be assessed and validated just like any other data because it's not an exception to the rule. And I understand that that's a little bit confusing, but just keep telling yourself it's either an exception or it isn't. And if it isn't, then we can use the tool to help us populate that no exception very quickly. So now would be a good time to pause and go ahead and run that tool and take a look at that. And I'm going to be right back. Okay. So hopefully you all got the fixed topo except to run. And again, remember that we are working in that third and final prepped geodatabase. So our next step is to find address range overlaps, okay? And what this tool is going to do is it's actually going to identify any overlapping road ranges within our road center lines. I really like this tool. I think it's really cool. And I don't know, I'm just kind of dorky, I guess, but I really enjoy using this tool. So what you're going to do is go into it's an enhancement tool. Yes, so in the enhancement tools, you're going to open find address range overlaps, and you're going to point it to the geodatabase and click add, and then click OK. Okay. And again, if you ever have any questions about the geoprocessing, because sometimes you don't get the little notice that that something completed, you can always reference the results window, and it tells us that it succeeded. Okay. So let's take a look at the results. If I go into my prepped geodatabase here, two things have occurred. Number one, there's a brand new feature class within the geodatabase. It's not within the feature data set, it's within the geodatabase itself. And then we also have a table that's been generated that's called field values check results. Okay. Now, field values check results is a table that you will see now and then as you're running through like the validations tools like this one. And it's basically just a repository for any anomalies that have been identified with some descriptive information, okay? So for example, this particular table, for this tool, it tells us the date that it was flagged. It shows us the description. Now, what I do want to point out here is that, and some people picked this up in class, some people didn't, this particular field in the description actually identifies the NGUID of the road centerline segment. So if you recognize road underscore centerline underscore 415 at cog.acog.ok.gov, that is the NGUID that we calculated previously. So again, this goes back to that kind of like logical order of sequential things. You definitely want to make sure that your NGUID is populated before you move on to some of these other tools, because that's going to be the most valuable piece that comes out of this. It's going to help you tie that anomaly straight back to that violating road centerline segment, in other words. Okay. So notice also that this tool generates a notice and not an error. Okay. A notice does not prevent submission, an error does. Okay. It only generates a notice. And the reason is because when we go back and we look here, I believe the MSAGCOM left and right are conditional. because we did not want there to be an error generated by this tool when it uses fields that are not mandatory. Okay, so this only generates a conditional, or I'm sorry, it only generates a notice. Okay, so you have a notice, but still, these are so easy to clean up. Like I would have no problem cleaning these up. It's super easy. Okay, so the description is basically going to tell you that it's a notice that, hey, these particular NGUIDs have overlapping address ranges. And if you scroll over in the table, it'll tell you the layer. Well, that's kind of obvious because only the center lines are going to have range information. It'll give you the field if it provides one, which this one does not. Again, it gives you a separate with the NGUID, and then it tells you what to check. So it's pretty descriptive. It's very helpful. Now, the actual feature class is just basically the geometry of those overlapping ranges. So you could just take these and drop them into your ArcMap, whatever you're using, for your regular data editing, and you could just drop these in here and fix them. You could symbolize them with a bright red color, and it's a quick visual to let you know where those are. Okay. So that is the find address range overlap, and that is going to be at the bottom of page 14 onto page 15 at the top. So I would go ahead and pause here if you want to run that on your own. So we're going to move on to the GeoCompare. And the sole purpose of the GeoCompare, let me bring this up again, is to populate the fields for RCL match and RCL side. Okay, so this is done within the address points feature class, and I'll show you those. Okay, RCL match and RCL side. It populates these two fields in the address points feature class. So basically what it does is it looks at every single address point and it says, hey, where are you located? Who is your road center line friend? And it will populate the RCL match field with the appropriate corresponding road center line segment. So if the address point is identified along a particular road center line segment, it's going to drop that NGUID into that field called RCL match. Okay, and then it's going to populate the RCL side based on the side of the road where it was found. Okay, so again, we can go back to the standard if we have any questions about that, and that again is going to be in the address points. So RCL match, RCL side, it's the NGUID of the road segment that the address point matches to, and then the RCL side is basically left or right side. All right, so let's take a look at that. And that is going to be, whoops, getting all discombobulated here. That is going to be on page 15. That's, again, the GeoCompare. So I'm going to point it to the appropriate geodatabase. Again, we're working in the third for prepped, and I'm going to click OK. And this one does take a moment. This is another one where you could open the results window to kind of monitor the progress there. Okay. So I just got a notice that my process succeeded. And let me close that. And the first thing I'm going to do is open my address point feature class and take a look. Okay, check it out. So our RCL match is populated if it found a corresponding road centerline segment to the address point that it was looking at. And then it did populate with right, left, or no match. So let me sort that. So you see here that where it did not find a match, these were left blank. Okay. Now let me bounce back over to the standard and ask you a question, even though you're not with me, but you're with me. Can we have blanks or nulls in a mandatory field? The answer is no, we cannot. So I think you know what I'm going to say next. There's a tool to help you. But first, let me go ahead. If you're following along, that's great. But if you want to take a minute and run this along with me, that is going to be a good time to pause your recording and run through the GeoCompare. Okay, and that's on page 15. So we are going to move on to the populate RCL match, no match. Okay. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to take everything here that's blank and it's going to populate it to a no match. Because again, you cannot have blanks or nulls in a mandatory field. Okay. So under enhancement tools, I'm going to open populate RCL match, no match. And I'm going to provide the geodatabase and click OK. And okay, so I will say that this is a problem that we've been experiencing, and I can try to totally close out of this. Sometimes this tool crashes without explanation. Sometimes it's like a pesky little schema lock somewhere that causes the tool to crash. Sometimes when you see that, it's actually already ran on the data. So let me open up my address points just to make sure. Yeah, so even though it crashed, it still populated. So basically what it did was everything that was blank here, it populated to no match. And that is something that we need to bring to the developer's attention, or maybe it's already been addressed with the most recent release of 4.0, I think. But just be advised that if that tool crashes on you, just take a look at the attribute table anyway, because maybe it did run. But that's the point of that is the point of populate RCL match, no match, is that it takes any of the blanks or nulls within the RCL match field, and then it just populates them with no match. Okay. So this is a good time to pause and work through that. And then we will go through the fish bones. Okay, so for those of you who have never heard of a fishbone analysis, basically at its simplest form, simplest explanation is it really is a visual geocode of how the address points are actually geocoding to the road center lines. Okay, and this helps us to identify several anomalies in our data. It can help us identify where our road ranges are too compact, or where we have, for example, some out of range addresses, not out of range, but out of order, I should say. If you have any addresses that are out of order, Fishbones will very quickly identify that. If you see a fishbone that intersects, multiple times, that could be a good indication that either it's out of order or the attributes are populated incorrectly. So it is a very, very powerful tool to QC your data. All right. Now, again, I will encourage you strongly to reference the manual here, the README, because there is an extensive explanation and description of how you would calculate it manually without the use of the toolkit. But I think that generating them with the toolkit has been very successful for us, and I think you should. Okay, there's more data that becomes available to you if you do it manually. But I think for most of us, just starting out anyway, using the toolkit, I think, is going to be sufficient. Okay. So what we want to do, and I'll show you here, this is the README for the generating the fishbone analysis. It's going to tell you, again, all of those fields that need to be populated. Okay. So if you find that, you have a run of this tool that's crashing, I would double check and make sure that, you have all of the required fields populated. Required for this toolkit, I mean. Okay. So again, you need your NGUID, you need your label, you can use the toolkit to help you populate both of those. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and run this. That's an enhancement tool. I'm going to point it to my prepped geodatabase. And the folder for the outputs, I'm just going to use the same folder that we used earlier when we created our geodatabase. And I'm just going to click OK there. And I am going to check the box for intersecting fishbones, because like I said, I think that's a really good, another really good way to see what's going on within the data. So I'm going to click OK here. Okay. Now, when I open this folder, you can see we have several outputs. So just ignore the test geodatabase. That's the one that we created earlier when we were going through that create geodatabase effort. What actually gets generated out of the fishbone analysis is 7 shapefiles plus a locator. Okay. And again, there is a manual process outlined here if you want to follow this, so that you can, do it manually if you wanted to. That's why you have the locator there. All right. So let's talk about these outputs for a second. So the address points with the lat long is basically the output of address points with nulls and zeros in the lat long fields excluded. So in those lat long fields, which are in the standard, those are optional, okay? But if you did not have them populated, this result is actually going to exclude those. All of ours were populated, so all of them were retained, okay? The geocode result is the actual endpoint of the fishbone, okay? So that if I look at the geocode results, that's actually the endpoint of the fishbone where the address point should geocode along the road center line. And if we look at the address point or the information, it's really like a combination of the addressing schema and then some geocoding info. Okay, but again, we're not really focusing on the attribute table portion of these outputs. The visual, I think, is where you're going to get the most value. The matched geocode results are only the matching records. So the ones that we ran previously where it found a match, that's what's going to be populated in here. The fishbone results is basically the line between your address point, and where the matched geocoded point is. Okay. The fishbone intersect is marking the location where any fishbones intersect. Okay, so this means they're crossing or intersecting. The intersect count is telling you how many times a fishbone intersects at a location. And then the fishbone results projected is just the fishbone results projected in state plane coordinate system. Okay. Oops. So I'm going to open up ArcMap real quick. Okay. I'm going to add in a few of these. So I'm going to add in my intersect count, my fishbone, and my geocode results. Okay. I'm also going to add in from my prepped the road center lines and my address points. Okay. And my road center lines, one of the things that we like to do here at Datamark is we like to symbolize the road center lines based on the direction of travel, because it can tell us a lot about the data and certain anomalies that we're seeing within the data. Okay, so one of the ways that we can do that is by clicking on the line symbol there below where it says road center line. It brings up the symbol selector. If you scroll all the way down, you'll see that there is an arrow at the end. If you choose that, what it's going to do is it's going to put an arrow at any vertex, but the arrow is going to be in the direction of travel or digitization. Okay. And so when we look at our data, we can really start to tell a story about why things look the way they do based on how the road center lines are drawn in. Because remember, you have to look at all of this stuff holistically. So when I zoom in here, you know, I can look at things like this, like why are these road center lines digitized in opposite directions? There might be a really good reason for this. I don't know. Right here, why is there a break in this road center line? I don't have my boundary data in here, but you know, really we want to see the road center lines broken at boundaries. Okay, anytime you have an attribute change where you have your community value changing or your zip code, you want to change those attributes and break that road center line there at that boundary change. Okay, because you need to again ensure consistency by reflecting the same values in all of your data sets. All right. So this is why we do this, okay? A lot of times if a road center line is digitized in an opposing direction, simply flipping it resolves a lot of those anomalies, okay? So that can be a big help. I will go ahead and symbolize my address points here in like an orange color and show the actual address itself. And then the intersecting, I can make like a red color. And the geocode, I'll just keep that like a dark color just to make it a little cleaner. All right, so let me zoom in here. This is my favorite street to pick on. So let's take a look. So I told you just a minute ago that a fishbone is a visual geocode of the address points, how they're geocoding along the road center line, okay, based on the range information that's provided, okay? So really what a fishbone does, if it's perpendicular or close to it, like if it looks like this or like this up here, that's really good. That's telling us that our geocoding is going to take our first responders down a street, and it's going to result in them being as perpendicular as possible to where the structure is. That's pretty much the goal of a fishbone, right? Is to show us that visual, okay? Now contrast that to what's going on up here. Let's take a look up here. So the northern part of the street, it starts up here, and the direction of travel goes south, and it terminates at this intersection, okay? The range along this street is 300 to 399. That's the street range. That's what we would call a theoretical range, because the actual range of the street is closer to like 300 to 335. Okay, so you have 334, which is all the way down here, but it's geocoding down here. And the reason it's geocoding down here is because the theoretical range of that street goes all the way up to 399. So what that's saying is where it terminates, that high range up there should be 399, but 334 is right here. So that's why you have all of these tiny, tight, compact fishbones in this part of the street here, because the expectation during the geocoding process is that, okay, well, if you're telling me that this street goes up to 399, then this is where all of these are geocoding up here. All right, so a way to balance the geocode or to make it more perpendicular would be to adjust that road center line range, okay? And what you could do is take it up to like 335. And then I guarantee you would have a much more perpendicular geocode fishbone that is better aligned to the reality of the situation, which is a range that's closer to 300 to 335. And so this always brings up the question, well, what do I need to use? Do I need to use actual, or do I need to use theoretical? The answer is yes. And I don't mean to be a smart aleck here, but I mean, truly, it's situational. You have to look at what's going on in your community and your addressing system and choose the ranges that are going to work the best for you. In urban areas where you have block addressing and you have very tight, compact, housing, maybe you have a lot of infill addressing, a theoretical range might work for you, okay? But when you go out and you spread out into the more rural areas, that's where you might find it a little bit more problematic. Okay, so you have to make the best judgment call for your unique situation. All right, so oftentimes adjusting the road center line segment is going to, align these fishbones more appropriately to their actual location. All right. Now, let's talk about the intersecting. Okay, so we see here, we have our fishbone intersect turned on. It's identifying an intersect here. And the reason is because you have a fishbone for 314, 322, then 318. Okay, so you have to look at why that is. Why are these truly out of order? Is it an attribute anomaly? Is it something weird with the driveways? Like, what is that? Okay. So that's why you would have an intersecting fishbone. All right, and you can see we have several. Like, look at these. This is 404, 410. So it's going from 402 to 410 to 404. So this is causing an intersecting fishbone, not only with 410, but also up here with 424. So again, why is this happening? And really, the data that you're getting from the fishbone analysis is actually going to cause you to ask just as many questions of the data as it is helping you tell a story about that data. Okay, yeah, if you have some things that are digitized in the wrong direction, it's going to be pretty straightforward for how to fix that. You're just going to flip that segment. But stuff like this can be a bigger situation. So this is where, it brings up a bigger conversation about, your addressing. Who's managing your addressing? Are they assigning addresses with public safety in mind? Because if you're seeing a lot of this type of stuff and you go and you do field visits and you determine, gosh, these really are like real life anomalies, and you see a lot of that, then maybe you need to ask if your addressing authority currently is the best person to be doing this. Because you don't want to have a lot of these situations, especially if the CAD system does not allow a lot of extra information in there, or if it's only pulling certain information from the GIS and you're not really able to pack the record with the GIS that you have, it becomes even more important. Okay. So I hope that answers the questions that you have about the fishbones. So again, fishbones, great visual geocode, great way to QC your data to see where you have some really weird anomalies. And like I said, you have stuff like this, like, okay, it's geocoding all the way down here, but the address point is all the way up here. What gives? What's the problem here? Oftentimes it's an address point that was like copy paste, and one or more of the attributes were not changed. And so they have to go back and be adjusted. And then you run this again and it's resolved. Okay. So a great tool for QC. So if you want to run this, that's going to be at the bottom of page 16. And there is an explanation of the results there, the outputs on page 17. There's also an explanation in the README. You can actually look at the generate fishbone analysis, or you can click on it to get even more information, and also how to run that process manually. So I'd go ahead and pause and run through that if you like. And then that brings us to our final stage here, which is the validation. Now let's talk about our validations. Validations are necessary before you provision your GIS data to the state's repository. Okay, all the data has to be validated before you submit it. Okay. Now the cool thing about the validations is that you have the ability to validate on individual feature classes, or you can do a check all required. Okay. So let's start here with the Check NINA ID. The Check NINA ID is going to make sure that the NGUID field within your data layers is formatted appropriately. This is not a big deal if you have gone through the effort of kind of like how we've worked through it through this exercise, where you have the standards compliant geodatabase with all of the fields present, and then you are going through and calculating that NGUID. Where you would want to run this is if you are maintaining that NGUID outside of the standards compliant geodatabase, say in your SDE, so that you can actually join it back to the validations at a later date. So you would want to run this Check NINA ID. What I will say is that when you run this, so let's go ahead and give it a layer name. I'll choose the address points and provide it with, this is for my prepped. I'll give it the address point layer and then point it to my NGUID. I can point it to a folder here. So I've used that tool outputs. This actually doesn't give you an output though. And I've tried this a couple of different ways, and I don't get an output. So I can refresh the folder, and then if I look in the folder, there's nothing in here for an output. All right, but if I go to my results, and I do a check, I look at the check NINA ID format and the messages, it tells me that it succeeded. And it says all NINA unique IDs are formatted correctly. So if you run this tool, I would just be advised that you're not actually getting a true output, like there's not a table or something. You do need to go to the results window, okay? Now, one important thing, and I told you earlier when we ran the GeoCompare or the range overlap, that it did generate this check results table. A couple things. Number one, you can delete the table. You could right click on it and delete it. There's also a tool within the validation tools to clear the table. This is one of those ones where you'll have multiple tools outputting to this table throughout your work on your data. Okay, and it's a best practice to go ahead and just get in there and clean it. Otherwise, it's going to compound the results. So if you come back to this 5 days later, it'll have another date, and then it'll have even more anomalies. So just to keep things clean, you can go ahead and clear that table by simply providing the geodatabase. And then I check both of these and click OK, and it's going to just empty that table right out for you. Okay, so you might want to consider that in between your validation runs as you're assessing your data, you're checking your template, you're doing the range overlaps, anything that outputs results to that table, you should go in and just clean, unless you don't mind the results being stacked on each other. I don't like that personally because I like to see the diminishing anomalies as I go through and move through and start cleaning my data. So that's just something that you want to get into a habit of doing, okay? So let's talk about the check template. And this was something that I actually, and I'm gonna scroll all the way up here. This was something that I actually was gonna open with, was the check template, just so that you guys could see what that looks like. And I can go ahead and show you that now. So what the check template does is, and again, I'm gonna open up my README just so y'all can see, the check template is going to check the layer list. So it's going to look for the required layers. We've already talked about that at length, right? It says it's going to report the missing required layers in the template check results. And it's also going to look for the feature data set named NG911. So it's going to be looking for it's going to be looking for these, and it's going to be looking for this. That's what it starts off by looking at, is the feature data set called NG911, and then all of the required layers within that feature data set. That's the check template, okay? It's also going to look for the required fields, the field values, submission counts, etc. Okay, but I wanted to point out this first because that is significant. So if I go back and I open the check template, I can provide any geodatabase, okay? So let me take you back to our source data, all right? Now, let's look at that again real quick. Our source data had, we know from earlier that it was non-compliant center lines, ESZs, and address points, but we did have two compliant feature classes, which were the discrepancy agency boundary and the PSAP boundary, okay? So we had kind of like a mix of compliant and non-compliant data. All right, but we know that the geodatabase itself was not compliant because we can assume that it was in my local coordinate system, or even if it was in WGS 84, I did not have that NG911 feature class or feature data set in there, okay, so that's missing. But I'm just gonna go ahead and run this anyway, just so you guys can see what that looks like on that source data. And so I'm just gonna leave these checked. I'm going to leave these checked, and you can see what these say. It's going to check for the layer list, the required fields, the values, etc. I'm going to click OK. Okay. So you can see within my source data initial that I have this template check results table that's been generated here with the results of that run on my source data, okay, which did include 2 compliant feature classes. Now, you see here that this is all errors, all right? Errors, again, prevent submission. So the first thing it's telling me is that I don't have a feature data set called NG911. Okay, now remember, if I go back to the README, that's required. You have to have the feature data set called NG911. And the reason for that is for that topology that it runs. Okay. So I don't have a feature data set called NG911. Well, let me tell you something. Even if you had 100% compliant feature classes and you dumped them into a geodatabase, if you did not have that feature data set called NG911, it stops there. This is doing an apples to apples comparison between a model standards compliant geodatabase, what those requirements are, versus what you have. Okay, so even if every single feature class, if it was perfect, if it was, you had every single properly named layer, if you had every single field, every single field was populated, everything was perfect. If you didn't have the feature data set, it's not going to find it. And it's going to tell you it doesn't exist. Because you can think of it as like a tree effect, like it's looking for one thing. Yes, go to the next thing. Yes. If something says no, then it stops there. Okay. Similarly, if you have standards compliant names, or I'm sorry, standards compliant feature classes, but the names are not correct. So say, for whatever reason, say you had address point that was fully standards compliant, but you called it SSAP, that's going to flag as not in the geodatabase because it's looking for these very specific naming conventions. All right. So that's just something to be mindful of. I can also run this on our second geodatabase just so you can see what that looks like. So let me run the check template on the second geodatabase. Now remember that the standards data initial was the one that had all the layers, it had all the fields, but some of the values were missing, okay? Because we had to go back in and do that field calculation. So I'm going to click OK. Okay, so that process has concluded. So let me expand that geodatabase. And you know, every time you run the tool, it's going to generate, you know, like I have the table was populated in here, and I have now a table populated in here. So let me look at the field values check results, because before we had looked at the template check results. The template, now I didn't change anything with the boxes. When I ran this, everything was checked, okay? So in the first one, I had the template check results table is populated with this. We already talked about this. We didn't talk about the field values check results, but this is basically looking at the domains, and it's telling us that, you know, we have these issues within these domains. Okay, but I wanted to focus on the template for this one. But notice how in this one, we don't have a template check results table generated because the template is there. So what this is saying is that checked that required layers are present. So if they weren't, then we would have that field values or that template check results table populated, but it only generated the field values check results, which is specifically looking at the values within the fields. Okay, so this one specifically relates back to the fields that were not populated that were mandatory. Okay, because remember in the second geodatabase, we had to do a bunch of field calculations on, we did them on the road center lines and on the fire ESBs, but there were still several for which we did not, you know, calculate any values, and that's okay. But I just wanted to point that out. All right. So, you know, I almost asked if there were any questions. If there are, then I would reach out to Charles or Shelley. But I did want to point out that check template and how that can be very useful to you, because it can really help you gauge. So like if you are working through your data and, you know, you run this and it's like, okay, well, why didn't it find these ones that I think are standards compliant? Go all the way back to the beginning. Do you have the standards compliant geodatabase? Does that geodatabase have the featured data set called NG911? Are your naming conventions appropriate? And I'm telling you, if you go with that prep geodatabase and you start with the prep tools, this should be a snap for you, because it's going to go ahead and give you the appropriate naming conventions through those processes. Okay. All right. So that's the check template. Now, like I said before, you can run individual validations, or I should say validations on individual feature classes. So if you wanted to run it on the address points, then, you know, there are specific checks that are just associated with the address points, specific checks that are just associated with the road center lines. And again, if you have any questions about what that functionality is, you can definitely go in here into the README and see what it's checking. Okay, so for the check address points, it's saying, okay, it's going to check the values against the domains. It's going to check the feature locations, the frequency, check if there's any duplicates. It's going to check to make sure that they have unique ID. And then it's also going to check ESN and Muni attributes, etc. The same with the roads and the boundaries. All right. So, you know, we can go ahead and run the check address points, and I'll just drop my addresses in there. Oops, it's at the geodatabase level, I forgot. So it's gonna look for all these things unless I tell it not to. I'm gonna click OK. Okay, so I'm now looking at the field values check results for the address validations we just ran. So what it's telling us is that, hey, we have 4 that are not inside the discrepancy agency boundary. Well, I can tell you that those are the ones we looked at earlier, where we talked about the PSAP A versus PSAP B scenario and the right-of-way coming through PSAP A, and then you have these structures that are outside of the discrepancy agency boundary, okay? So it's telling us, hey, you've got some errors here, and then it's also telling us that we've got duplicates. Okay, so what we would need to do is go through and look at the duplicate information and try to figure out why it's that way, and basically resolve that, because again, these are errors. So when errors are generated, they have to be resolved. All right. And I can scroll through. Now remember, as you're working through and cleaning up your data, you may want to consider running through that clear table within the validation tools. You might want to clear the results table to get rid of all of that old stuff, because it's not going to auto populate. It's just going to keep compiling and compounding those results in there. So if I scroll over, I can see that I have the NGUID, and then it's telling me what I need to check. Okay, so check the location. It's outside of the discrepancy agency boundary, so do something about it. And then the frequency, okay, it's duplicate. We've got to do something about that. All right. And then, like I said, you can run individual validations on other feature classes as well. It really just depends on, what you want to do. Now, I will say that, some of you who have not really cleaned up your data, or maybe you feel like this is going to be a huge effort for you and you're not sure where to start, you may want to start by just running it on individual feature classes first. You may want to start there, because it might be too overwhelming to do everything all at once. And then you just see thousands upon thousands of anomalies. So, this is especially helpful if you have different people within your org who are managing these different data sets. So if you have somebody who manages your address points, you can just run this and send it to them. And if you already have, the NGUID in your SDE, you can, join that and then take a look at things and see what's going on. Okay, so this is really beneficial for that. Another thing you can do is the check all required. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear the results table, because I'm going to run the check all required. Okay. And that's going to check everything. And you just have to give that a second. Okay, and I did open up the results window just so I can verify what's going on. And again, this is checking everything. So what you can do if you want to see what's going on is, again, if you go to check all required, here is the list of everything that's being checked. Okay. So again, the README is your best friend. You're going to refer to this when you have the toolkit open, and you're going to use this to check back and forth and make sure you have all those fields populated before you drive yourself nuts trying to figure out, why something didn't run, because it's probably because you didn't have something populated. So, just keep the README open as you're working through. Okay. Almost finished. Okay. So it succeeded. It did notify us that we've got some stuff going on, but that's okay. I mean, that's what's expected from this check all required. So let's take a look at the results. Again, those are going to populate in the field values check results table. And if I open that table, you can see here that I have 10,893 errors. Okay. And I know that this might seem overwhelming to you, and that's understandable. I think Charles said he had over 1 million when he ran this on his data. But what I do want to point out to you is that if you are missing a mandatory field, okay, so if it's present within the data but it's not populated, what's going to happen is it's going to flag as an error on every single feature within the feature class. Okay, so in this case, I am missing the, I don't have populated, I should say, the initial source, the revision date, and the revision editor. And if I look back at the standard, and we left these in here on purpose, by the way. So the initial source, the initial date, and the revision editor, all three of these are mandatory fields. All three of those are mandatory fields. So consequently, what happened is it flagged all three of those times however many address points were in my feature class. All right. So when you see something like this, when you see these huge numbers, that's often the problem. If you have 100,000 address points, and you're missing 3 or 4 field values on these mandatory fields, I mean, you're going to get a lot of errors. But the good news is that just as quickly as they're identified, you can fix them by doing a field calculation. Okay, so just populate the field, and the next time you run it, it should be fine. And this is another good reason to clean the table in between your validations, because you don't want to see this come back again, right? You want to make sure that what you're doing is effective and that it's actually helping the data become cleaner and more standardized, and ultimately result in fewer errors for submission. So that's what a lot of these are. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's what most of these are. So through a simple field calculation, you can get through these. Okay. Now, one of the things I can do is also start up here. So we did get this notice generated again, because part of that check all required is to check for overlapping address ranges. It's in here somewhere, but it does check for overlapping as part of that check all required. It also gives us those topology issues. So you see we have all these dangles, we have gaps, anything that violated a topology rule that was not resolved is going to show up here in this run. Okay, C must cover each other, must be properly inside. Those are specifically relating to, I believe, those address points. Yep, address points. So, this is just to further explain the results that you're seeing. but yeah, a lot of these are going to be topology. A lot of these are going to be where, like I said, you had a mandatory field and you forgot to calculate it or something, and consequently you're going to have a ton of errors. Okay, a null street, got to fix that. You know, and then of course we have some fields within our boundary data that have not been populated, that need to be populated. Okay. So that's just kind of the check all required in a nutshell. Again, if you are the master and commander of all of your data and you want to run this, then go for it. If you are a person who likes to see things broken down by feature class, or you say, you know, this month I want to focus on cleaning up the address points. That's what our main focus is going to be. Or I have somebody in planning who manages our address points. I'm just going to do this and export the results and give it to them. Then you run it individually. But if you're a person who wants to just knock everything out all at once, then you could do the check all required. It really doesn't matter as long as the end result is the same, which means that the data is ultimately corrected and you don't have any errors. Okay. I wish I could hear if you have any questions, but it's just me. So we're going to go back to the PowerPoint. That concludes the toolkit actual demo part. I did want to talk about some best practices and recommendations going forward for your GIS data maintenance. So the first thing is to know your data. I know that we kind of beat this horse to death earlier with talking about understanding the business needs, the field mapping, understand like what applications your data is supporting, what fields are required to support those applications. But it's so incredibly important. You don't want to go through this effort of transforming your data only to have somebody hollering at you 3 months from now saying, why did you change that? Didn't you know I needed that for X, Y, or Z? Okay, so understand it. Know who your data authority is, because often that can help you tell a further story about your data, especially the quality. Like I said, if you have a lot of weird stuff going on in your data, things that are problematic, if you have a lot of anomalies in your address points and somebody is in your organization and not assigning them with public safety in mind, then this could be your sign that you need to take that authority from them. As someone who does strategic planning, this is something that I have recommended countless times, because, just because we've always done it a certain way doesn't mean that's the way we should continue to do it going forward. Okay, and you really need to keep public safety in mind when you're assigning addresses, you're approving road center lines, etc. Okay. Education, if you're going to keep things the way they are, then you need to educate people. Okay. You need to educate them about these best practices for data management, educate them about, how to assign addresses, get them back to basics with public safety, help them to understand the point of why we're doing what we're doing. It goes a long way. Going back to that data quality conversation, the toolkit should be an iterative process. This is not a one and done. Okay, the toolkit is really going to help you in the completeness aspect, in the accuracy, and a lot of times in the consistency, but you're going to have to work on the other aspects, in your org. You're going to have to make sure that, the data is moving, your workflows are moving the data in a way that's conducive to timeliness, okay, availability. So for data maintenance, follow attribution standards, parse the data. If you have all of your addressing data concatenated into one field, you'll want to parse that out into its individual components. You'll want to make sure that you're standardizing your street types. Again, the NENA standard, the national standard, and the state standard both mandate for information exchange that you have unabbreviated values. So you have to start spelling out those values within your addressing and your road center lines. So spelling out the words north, south, east, and west, spelling out the street suffixes or the street types. Okay. using a true null in your data instead of blanks, making sure that your house number is an integer value, managing your subaddressing in a separate field, okay? Now, one little pin that I'm going to stick in this conversation is that subaddressing is one of the most mismanaged parts of addressing in general in local government. And the reason is because it's been done in many cases inconsistently. Maybe the post office does it, maybe people make up their own addresses. I mean, gosh, you name it, I've seen it. The data model, both at the state and the national level, allows subaddressing down to the seat, Now, this is definitely not something that I recommend. Unless you have a very solid plan in place and you are in a community that has a lot of sky rises, or there's a real need to have a seat level subaddressing, I don't recommend going down to that level. However, I do think it's really important to not only subaddress your community, but also make sure that that subaddressing is reflected in your GIS and also for your first responders. Pack the record for them. There's no such thing as too much information, especially if it's accurate information. Okay, you want to make sure that you're providing as much descriptive information as possible, especially if somebody arrives on scene and there's 6 different buildings and each building could have, 12 different subaddresses within it. You want to be as descriptive as possible. If you can, give each building its own address and then do subaddressing within there, and then even provide a floor, that is so good. That is so, so good. I want to see nationwide everyone improving their subaddressing, okay? But for right now, just getting it represented is a good start. Again, standardizing the street types within the addresses and the road center lines, and ensuring consistency across the different data sets. So making sure that your data all reflects the same information, your ESN, your postal code, your community values. All of these things are areas where we see inconsistencies within people's data. So the legacy fields are super important, okay? The legacy fields are what are the fields that are going to allow you to continue doing the same business for today going forward until things change in the future, okay? So make sure that you're populating those legacy fields, because those are the ones that are going to continue supporting the 911 system, the CAD system, any business needs where you're using those abbreviated legacy values. Boundaries. Again, beating this poor horse to death, but you definitely need to work together, GIS and PSAP. Make sure that you understand call routing boundaries are PSAP decisions. They are for call routing, not legislative. Don't conflate the two. You can adjust your call routing boundaries, and you should. If you're finding areas where you have a lot of transfers, or there are just areas in general where you don't think that the boundary is reflecting where the call is supposed to go, get together with your neighboring PSAPs. This is also another service that we offer as a vendor. We do boundary workshops. I sit in these all the time and I guide people and help them to understand the best decisions to make for their data, okay? When you download that PSAP and discrepancy agency boundary, make sure you review it. Don't just take it for granted. Don't take it for face value. Download it, review it together with your PSAP, and then go through the process that we discussed in B1 to refine or adjust as necessary. So thinking about the path forward, strategic planning, no bias here, but it is really important to understand how data, how workflows are shaping your data environment as it relates to NG911. Okay, so a strategic plan can help tremendously with that, especially as it concerns like gap analysis and the path forward for recommendations to improve those workflows and improve the data maintenance. Having a data maintenance plan, super important. Understanding that this toolkit, like I said, this is not a one and done. You're going to want to continually validate your data, and you need to do it routinely. This is not like an annual thing. You want to do this as often as you're doing a lot of editing. So whether you set it up quarterly whether you set it up monthly, whether you set it up weekly, I don't care. You need to have a plan going forward. This is data that's making mission critical life and mission critical decisions. So you want it to be at its best. Okay, and that's going to involve ongoing QA and QC. All right, so get used to the toolkit, get familiar with it, look at the README, run through the exercises as often as you need to learn how to do it. Each time you do it, it's going to get easier. Okay. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Charles or Shelley. I do encourage you to come in person to B3. That's going to be the first 2 weeks of August. We're doing a hybrid virtual and in person like we did for B2. But we're hoping to get as many people in person as possible just because it makes for a really fun experience. I hope that this has been beneficial for you. I'm sad that I didn't get to have a live class to interact with during this recording, but unfortunately that's just the way it goes sometimes when you're mixing technologies. So we had to have a little workaround here, but I do appreciate your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful day and good luck with everything with your data.